Chapter 44. The Three Realms Divine sect had been on the decline for many years. Even if it still had some reputation, even if it could occasionally stir up some bad things, at least from the situation in the past 10 years, this sect was no longer on the stage. Hence, the tense and somber atmosphere was actually only within the true Immortal Alliance. In fact, most of it was only on the side of the Floating Clouds Agency. Of course, the order to investigate the Three Realms Divine sect had already been issued by the higher-ups. Various forces had also started to move slowly. There were activities in the open and in the dark. However, at least on the surface, the Immortal City didn't seem to have changed much. At most, it was just a topic of conversation after a meal. The former inspector of Fuyunji, Old Lu, finally handed over all his responsibilities on this day. He could be considered to have completely retired from his post. His feelings were a little complicated. He was a little disappointed, but also a little happy. He was happy because being able to work in Zhengxianmeng was the most desirable and best choice for most cultivators, especially the disciples of the small and medium-sized sections. Here, they had the opportunity to get better resources and better opportunities, as well as the respect that they usually couldn't get. On the other hand, he was disappointed because of the price of those things. Many times, they had to sweat, bleed, or even risk their lives. But after he retired, all of that would come to an end. Old Lu didn't know many people in Fuyunji, but he still had a few acquaintances. Therefore, on this day, everyone gathered together to drink for him. Unfortunately, the young man that he had high hopes for, Bianzhe, had already left Immortal City a few days earlier due to his duties. Therefore, he couldn't send him on his last journey before he retired. Old Lu was a little regretful, but it was also a very enjoyable thing to drink and chat with his other old brothers in Fuyunji. He was almost at the end of his journey, and most of the time, he had already seen through things, so he didn't have to hold back when he spoke. After drinking too much, he even half smiled and half seriously said some words that he wouldn't normally dare to say to his immediate superior who came to visit him. That superior was a woman. She was usually stern and strict, but on this night, she just laughed it off and didn't take it to heart. On the contrary, the faces of the people around the table changed. They looked at Old Lu as if they were looking at a monster, and no one spoke. Old Lu sensed something, but the alcohol got to his head and he couldn't react in time, so he didn't think about it anymore. When he slowly woke up, it was already the morning of the next day, and it was time for him to leave the Immortal City. That morning, Old Lu broke out in cold sweat as he sat on the bed, and then he packed his bag and ran away. He didn't dare to stay in the Immortal City for a moment longer, and he didn't even care about his agreement with his old brothers to send him off. Fortunately, he didn't encounter any accidents on his way out of the city. It seemed that the woman with the nickname Black Widow wasn't angry for once. Old Lu felt lucky in his heart, but at the same time, he was wary of his own stupidity. He had been cautious all his life, but he actually did such a stupid thing before he passed away. As these thoughts crossed his mind, he walked out of the grand and majestic city gate of Immortal City and gradually walked away. On the bustling and crowded street outside the city, people came and went. Amidst the silence, amidst the hustle and bustle, a shrill cry suddenly came from afar. Many people did not even have time to react. However, there were also people who heard the voice and clearly repeated it when they investigated. On that morning as usual, Old Lu, who was rushing out of the city, suddenly disappeared, and the last cry he left behind was like this: Blood Warbler. However, the ordinary people didn't know the truth. Zhengxianmeng Fuyunji, the beloved general under true Lord Tianlan, wielded great power in Fuyunji, and even in the enormous Zhengxianmeng, there was a famous leader, the Hall Master, who was a woman called Shuaying, nicknamed Blood Warbler. At daybreak, Ding Dang and Lu Chen woke up. Without saying anything more, Ding Dang quickly left the place. Lu Chen sent her to the intersection and didn't continue down the mountain. He looked at the back of the woman who left in a hurry, and remained silent. When she was on the mountain, did something happen? Why did she look so weak and helpless last night? Was she afraid of Lu Chen, afraid of death, or afraid of something else? After that, she didn't say anything, and Lu Chen didn't ask again. The days quickly calmed down again, or perhaps on the surface, these days never changed, forever repeating day after day. Ding Dang didn't come to find Lu Chen again. That night in the darkness, she used a slightly trembling voice to say those words, as if they were just murmurs in the darkness, quietly drifting in the wind. Lu Chen continued to live alone, occasionally going to the small tavern at the foot of the mountain to drink, but most of the time he stayed in his grass hut. Every day, he would try to recultivate on his own, but the aptitude of the 5 elements divine disc that he had been reborn with was a little too poor, making his path of cultivation extremely difficult. The spiritual power in his body was next to nothing, and he didn't make much progress with each day. However, Lu Chen didn't lose heart, on the contrary, he continued to persevere, and began to walk on this path that he had walked before. As for the dark side of the divine disc, after that night, he didn't touch it again. Because when he thought back to the situation in the darkness, Lu Chen clearly felt, at least at that moment, when the darkness was at its most turbulent, he faintly felt that he lost control of his own mind and body. And that black spiritual power, from the 2 attempts, was almost certain to be related to slaughter and death. Lu Chen didn't fear blood, nor did he fear the darkness. In his silent years, these 2 things had always accompanied him through those days. However, if it was spiritual energy that could only be obtained through killing and death, this kind of thing still exceeded the limits of Lu Chen's heart. Moreover, there was an unremarkable but important matter that made Lu Chen subconsciously keep a little distance from the divine disc of darkness. It was a pot of strange sour rabbit meat. Old Lu died. The hot sun shone outside the house. Although it was a little cooler inside the pub, it wasn't much better. The sweat on old Ma's head was still seeping out. He wiped it with a towel, half covering his face, and said in a flat tone to Lu Chen. How did he die? The day he left Immortal City, he disappeared outside the east gate of Immortal City. Someone heard shouting, but no one found him. When he was found again, old Lu was already a corpse, thrown in the black pine forest outside the west gate. Even his corpse had been half-eaten by wild beasts. Lu Chen was silent for a while, and asked, was it the devil cult? Old Ma sighed and put down the towel in his hand. Then, he said, during this period of time, 2 patrol envoys of the Floating Clouds Division have died consecutively. Zhang Jiuping was definitely killed by the devil cult, but old Lu can't be sure for now. For the time being, there are no traces of the devil cult on him. N. Chapter 45. Seeing that old Ma was hesitant to speak, Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and said, "What's wrong?" Old Ma laughed bitterly and said, "This matter is quite. It is said that on the day old Ma disappeared, many people on the main road outside the Immortal City heard that exclamation at the same time, but what old Lu shouted was not cursing the evil sect, he called out Hall Master Shue's name." Lu Chen's expression changed slightly and said in a low voice, "Shuang?" Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes. The atmosphere in the Immortal Alliance is a little tense and Fuyunji is also in chaos. As for Hall Master Shue, I heard that he has been in seclusion for a few days." Lu Chen thought for a while and shook his head. Although Shui Ying's temper is not good, she should not be a spy of the evil sect. Old Ma was a little surprised and looked at Lu Chen and said, "I remember that you have never met her before, how can you be so sure?" Lu Chen said indifferently, 10 years ago, she participated in the battle in the desolate valley." Old Ma became silent and after a while, he nodded and did not speak anymore. There was no need to talk about the treacherous situation in the Immortal City and the unfathomable dangers, but it seemed to be too far away and did not seem to affect the small mountain village thousands of miles away. The villagers of Enchanting village were still living quietly, working hard for the illusory dream in most people's hearts. On the morning of the 6th of August, when Lu Chen was going down the mountain as usual, he once again met Ding Dang, who was walking up the mountain. It was different from when they met a few days ago. Lu Chen could tell that Ding Dang did not seem to be in a good condition today. Her appearance was still beautiful, but her expression seemed to be a little haggard. She was no longer in high spirits but seemed to have something on her mind. Even when Lu Chen brushed past her, she who had been slightly bowing her head did not notice. For some reason, Lu Chen did not call out to her and only silently watched the woman walk up the hill and walk alone towards the distant dragon lake at the top of the mountain. Wasn't that a huge gamble? Was the wager his entire life? The figure in the distance looked extremely fragile and lonely. After she disappeared into the forest, Lu Chen silently turned around and walked back to the village. But for some reason, that lonely figure still lingered in his heart when he walked into the tavern. There was always a strange feeling of unease that he couldn't get rid of. Old Ma saw him and quickly walked over. His face was solemn with a hint of nervousness. He closed the door and pulled Lu Chen to sit down. Lu Chen frowned and looked at the nervous fatty. What's wrong? Old Ma took a deep breath and lowered his voice. Something's not right. A glint flickered in the depths of Lu Chen's eyes as he said, Speak. Old Ma replied, I've just received news that 3 people from the Fuyan Agency's shadow guards have died in succession during this period of time. They were all killed by someone. He raised his head and glanced at Lu Chen. There was a hint of dryness in his voice as he said in a low voice, Among the people who died, one of them was the shadow that Zhang Jiuping was in charge of. The other 2 were contacted by old Lu in the past few years. Lu Chen was silent. He sat at the table and did not speak. Old Ma looked at him for a while and said softly, There's still no news that directly points to the 3 Realms Divine sect as the culprit, but it's them. They would rather kill the wrong person than let them go. Lu Chen suddenly interrupted him. Old Ma paused for a moment. Then he gritted his teeth and said, If that's the case, we can't just sit and wait for death. Before he finished, his voice suddenly lowered as if he thought of something. At the same time, Lu Chen also shook his head slightly and said, There's something strange about Fuyunji. There's either a traitor or they're being watched. We can't look for them. Old Ma nodded slowly. His face gradually calmed down. He frowned for a moment and said, You're right. I'll arrange this. Let's leave this place. Lu Chen asked, How long? Old Ma said, 3 days, 2 days at the earliest. Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, If we suddenly disappear, it'll mean that there's something strange here. It might attract the attention of the evil sect's demons. I'm just a fugitive. What about you? Old Ma snorted and said, I'm fine. Didn't I survive a few years ago? Moreover, not many people in the Immortal Alliance know my background. There are at most 2 people. Lu Chen glanced at him and said, Who is it? Old Ma said, Perfected Lord Tianlan and Hall Leader Shui. Lu Chen nodded and stood up. He said, Arrange it as soon as possible. Old Ma said, Okay, walking out of the tavern. It was still sunny and hot outside. The quiet mountain village under the sun seemed especially peaceful and quiet. Lu Chen looked around. He had an inexplicable feeling in his heart. He had lived here for 10 years and knew everything here. Although the villagers here were not all good people and he was just acquainted with them, he still unexpectedly felt a trace of warmth when he looked at the village. However, he quickly swept this trace of emotion out of his mind. He turned around and walked towards the thatched hut. In that lonely house at the foot of the mountain, he also had some things to tidy up. Lu Chen's footsteps paused when he walked past the large pagoda tree. He glanced at the old fisherman who was fishing and smiled. In the end, he did not go up to say anything, and instead walked over. The cicadas screamed with all their might behind him, as if they were going crazy against the hot weather. When walking up the mountain path, Lu Chen looked up at the tea mountain. All these years, perhaps the only person who was really close to him was that woman. Unfortunately, she had bet on someone else. But that was good. No matter what, someone else had a better future than him. There was a bitter smile at the corner of his mouth, but in the next moment, his smile suddenly froze because at this moment, he suddenly saw somewhere on the peak of Tea Mountain in the distance, there was suddenly a flash of fiery light, and then after waving for a moment, it quickly disappeared. Was that a torch in the daytime? If this was a gamble, he had to bear the consequences himself. Lu Chen walked into his thatched hut and began to pack his things. However, as he walked around the hut, he picked up and put things down. After a while, he sat down on the side of the bed and sighed, thinking that he really had nothing to worry about. He sat silently for a while, his eyes calm but inadvertently at a loss, but he quickly calmed down. After a while, he suddenly stood up, opened the door, and walked out, walking towards the tea mountain. The spirit tea trees all over the mountain swayed in the wind. The green leaves were still full of life, as if they were not frightened by the scorching sun even in the height of summer. Chapter 46. Lu Chen walked on the mountain road and gradually climbed higher. The thatched hut behind him and the village at the foot of the mountain gradually became smaller. The stream that flowed through Enchanting village also looked like a long, thin snake. The tea mountain was very quiet. There were birds chirping and the sound of the wind, but it was still very quiet. There were many mountain roads, and from time to time there would be forks in front of him. Lu Chen would occasionally stop and think carefully, then look up at the top of the tea mountain, recalling the direction of the torch that suddenly appeared not long ago, and then continue to walk forward. About an hour later, he stopped on a mountain road that was close to the top of the mountain. About 10 feet in front of him, under a spirit tea tree, there was a withered branch that had fallen. It was charred black, as if it had been burned. Lu Chen stared at the branch for a moment, then walked over and squatted down beside it. He picked it up and carefully examined it for a moment, then suddenly touched the charred end of the withered branch. There was still some residual warmth on the branch. He silently stood up and looked around, at the ground, the grass, and the forest. There were messy footprints, wild grass that had been stepped on, broken branches, and broken leaves. The mountain wind blew, and the mountain peak seemed to be a bit chilly. Lu Chen stood in the same place for a while, then continued to walk forward expressionlessly, towards the back of the tea mountain, in the direction of the west foot of the mountain peak. Splash! A burst of splashing sound suddenly came from the clear water stream, but it startled Lao Yu under the big locust tree. He looked up and saw that the fishing float in the stream was shaking violently. He was startled at first, then overjoyed, and with a cry of surprise, he hurriedly reeled in the line. But the fishing line was first taut, then suddenly pulled back violently. A strong force suddenly came, and after a muffled sound, the fishing line broke in the middle. Lao Yu involuntarily took 2 steps back, his heart sinking. Just as he was about to continue doing something, he saw a black shadow suddenly flash in the depths of the water, and in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. There was a burst of ripples on the stream, like wind blowing over the surface of the water, but soon it slowly calmed down. In the clear water, there was no longer any abnormality, it was exactly the same as before. Aya! The old fisherman growled angrily, stomping his feet and pounding his chest in frustration. At this moment, he suddenly heard a voice behind him. Someone said with a gentle smile, "What a pity. That seems to be a big fish." Old Yu turned around and saw a young man standing under the large pagoda tree behind him. He was dressed in a long white robe and had delicate features. He held a folding fan in his hand and there was a painting of mountains and rivers drawn on the surface of the fan. Even though it was a hot summer day, he still looked somewhat elegant and otherworldly. This young man's smile was very gentle, and he was also very good-looking. At first glance, he made people feel very comfortable and pleasing to the eye. After Old Yu saw this young man, his first impression was that this guy seemed to look better than Li Ji from a few days ago. However, he had never seen this person before. He didn't seem to be from Enchanting village, and Old Yu wasn't someone who was good at socializing. He frowned and turned his head away without a word. He continued to pick up the fishing rod and reel the fishing line. The young man behind him wasn't in a hurry. He looked at Old Yu with a smile and said after a while, "Old sir, have you been fishing here for a long time?" "Oh." Old Yu didn't want to answer, but the young man's attitude was too good. It made him feel a little apologetic, so he subconsciously agreed. The young man smiled and fanned himself twice. He looked at the sky and said, "Although it's quite uncomfortable on such a hot day, I heard that some fish are different when it's hot and will float to the surface. That's probably what happened just now." Old Yu was shocked. He turned around to look at him and said, "Is that true?" The young man smiled and closed his fan. He cupped his hands and said, "I only heard about it. I don't dare to guarantee it." Old Yu thought about it and nodded. "All right, I'll continue fishing." The young man nodded with a smile and didn't say anything. He just stood under the shade of the big locust tree, as if this was a leisurely life. Old Yu didn't have any aversion to it. After all, the young man didn't disturb him while he was fishing. It was just that when he occasionally looked around, he would suddenly notice that there were more figures in some corners and roads of the village in the distance. Those people's faces seemed a little unfamiliar. Unlike Lu Chen, who had nothing to worry about, when the plump old ma packed his luggage in the back hall of his small tavern, he found that there seemed to be a lot of things that belonged to him, or rather, he wanted to take with him. He packed one thing after another and packed one bag after another until even he couldn't stand it anymore. He stared at the pile of luggage in the room and muttered with a depressed expression, "Forget it. If that guy sees this, I'm afraid he'll scold me to death." He shook his head with a look of regret and pain on his face. He sighed and kicked away a few bags of luggage. He picked up a few more and put them aside. After a while, there were only 3 bags left in the middle of the room. After that, Old Ma stopped cleaning up. Instead, he walked to a wall and pushed open a cabinet. Then, his hand groped in the corner for a moment, and a secret door opened. A bulging bag was lying in this secret compartment. From time to time, there was a slight sound of impact, as if there were many small stones in it. Old Ma carefully lifted the bag with a satisfied expression. He touched it gently with his hand and hugged it hard. Then, he walked back to the middle of the room and stuffed it into the depths of one of the luggage. After doing this, Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief and showed a satisfied expression. He looked around and was about to leave the room. Suddenly, there were a few clear knocks on the door of the tavern in front of him. Knock, knock, knock. Accompanying the knocks was the gentle voice of a young man. He seemed to be smiling as he said, "Is anyone there?" Old Ma turned around and looked at the entrance of the tavern. He didn't know why, but he suddenly frowned. The sun shone down with thousands of golden rays. It was incomparably hot, but the water of the Dragon Lake behind Tea Mountain was still as calm as a mirror. It was like a beautiful gem embedded in the mountain. When people approached the lake, they would feel a trace of moisture and coolness that was rare in this hot weather. The mountain was green and the water was blue. The mountain peak was reflected in the water, and the lake and mountains were beautiful. Between the mountains and rivers, it was a peaceful place. However, at this moment, there was a burst of noise coming from the lakeside. 2 figures stood by the lakeside, a man and a woman facing each other. Chapter 47. Behind Tea Mountain, Dragon Lake, Lakeside. The man was handsome and the woman was beautiful. They were supposed to be a match made in heaven, but for some reason, they were glaring at each other, arguing about something. The woman was Ding Dang, and the man was Li Ji, who had joined the Thousand Autumns Gate a few days ago. At this moment, Ding Dang looked to be in a sorry state. Her clothes and one side of her sleeves had traces of being torn. Her hair was also a little messy. A strand of her hair was slightly slanted, falling onto her snow-white cheeks. On the other hand, Li Ji did not seem to have any abnormalities, but his eyebrows were furrowed, his face was filled with anger. He stared at Ding Dang, his mouth was filled with suppressed anger, and he roared, why do you have so many words? Didn't I already tell you many times? Welcoming you into the sect can't be rushed, it has to be done slowly." Ding Dang laughed coldly, her eyes as sharp as knives. She said hatefully, "Who do you think you're trying to fool? When you took my spirit stones, everything was agreed upon. As long as you joined the Thousand Autumns Gate, you would immediately welcome me into the sect and we would cultivate together. It's only been a few days, and you're already going back on your word?" Li Ji's face turned green, and he said angrily, "How can it be so easy? I'm not the only one in charge. What's more, Elder Su died a horrible death to the demonic sect not long ago. Now the entire sect is in a frenzy, and everyone is chasing the demonic sex murderer. How can I bring this up? Ding Dong's expression didn't change, and she only laughed coldly. You make it sound so nice, but do you think I'm a country bumpkin? I've already asked around, and the Thousand Autumns Gate can't do anything about it. We can only report it to Zhengxianmeng and ask the Immortal Alliance to investigate. Now that the Thousand Autumns Gate has taken care of Elder Su's funeral matters, there are no other restrictions. Didn't your gate master just accept a new disciple a few days ago? Li Ji's expression froze, and he was speechless for a moment. Ding Dang bit her lips and stomped her foot. If you insist on refusing, then return the spirit stones to me and help me gather the remaining 1,000 spirit stones according to our original agreement. Let me take a trip to the immortal mirror. Whether I live or die, whether I become an immortal or a mortal, I will leave it to fate. Li Ji clenched his fists tightly, his face flushed red as he said, Where do I get so many spiritual stones now? Ding Dang stared at him for a long time before saying, This won't do, that won't do. Today you are the only one who has entered the immortal sect and cultivated the immortal Tao. Your future is bright, but I have to stay in this small village in the mountains and suffer the torment of others. Every day I look forward to seeing you, but it is hard for me to see you. Do you know how it feels? Saying the last sentence, Ding Dong's eyes were red, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Li Ji gritted his teeth and said, I said, this matter cannot be rushed. Give me some more time. Ding Dang rubbed her eyes. She did not know why, but when she looked at Li Ji, her expression slowly softened. Her eyes had a trace of mournful sorrow as she said in a low voice, Li Lang, my feelings for you, could it be that you really do not understand? Li Ji lowered his head, and did not say a word. Ding Dang took a step forward and said, From the first time I saw you, I fell in love with you. From the moment you drew me those paintings, I wanted to be with you for the rest of my life. For you, I am willing to do anything, do you know that? She sobbed softly and said, I do want to cultivate, but I want to be with you even more. The two of us will cultivate together in the future and be free and unfettered. We'll live forever and never grow old, and we'll be immortal companions. Is that okay? Okay. Saying that, she reached out and grabbed Li Ji's hand, hugging it to her chest, and looked at him with a sorrowful expression. Li Ji raised his head, and the expression on his face changed a few times. Hesitation, apprehension, joy, yearning, sadness, fear, and all sorts of other emotions flashed across his face in that short moment. On his palm, the warmth of the girl's body came, and the familiar feeling of soft skin. His expression suddenly became cold, and looking at Ding Dong's eyes, he said coldly, How many men's hands have you held like this? Ding Dong's body suddenly trembled, as if she had fallen into an ice cellar, and even her hands turned cold in that instant. She took a step back, but her body suddenly stopped. It was Li Ji who had grabbed her hand, and tightly grabbed it. He opened his eyes wide, and for some reason, his expression looked somewhat sinister. He took a step forward, and in an instant, he got close to Ding Dang, and stared at her. His gaze was as sharp as a blade, as if he wanted to see through this girl's deepest heart. Even his words, at this moment, seemed very sharp. Before me, how many men have you slept with? Ding Dong's entire body started to tremble, her face was snow white, and her lips were trembling non-stop. Her chest was heaving up and down intensely, but it was as if she was unable to breathe, and only tears kept flowing crazily. She looked at Li Ji and shook her head with all her might, but not a single word came out of her mouth. Li Ji clenched his teeth, and that handsome and extraordinary face of his was somewhat distorted. He angrily looked at Ding Dang, and suddenly swung his hand, throwing Ding Dong's hand away, and angrily roared, You slut, why did you lie to me? Ding Dong's body involuntarily staggered a few steps back, her face was covered in tears, and she cried out, It's not like that, I really like you, I really want to live with you for the rest of my life. Who wants to live with you for the rest of my life? Li Ji shouted, interrupting Ding Dong's words. His eyes looked a little red, and he gritted his teeth and said, A lowly and shameless girl like you, a whore who can sleep with anyone, dares to dream about the immortal Tao, scram. Ding Dang seemed as if she couldn't even stand steadily, and in an instant, she sat on the ground, and her face was pale. Looking at Li Ji, she seemed to be somewhat incoherent. How can you be like this? At that time when you asked me for money, and said those sweet nothings to me, you weren't like this. Li Ji kicked a stone beside him, and it directly fell into the dragon lake, and with a put-ong sound, it seemed that at this moment, his heart was also filled with anger. He pointed at Ding Dang, unable to restrain his anger, as if he was staring at a life-and-death enemy, and loudly said, "Why didn't you tell me clearly at that time? You used that dirty money to pave the road for me, but it was all for yourself, right?" Ding Dang laughed bitterly, looking at that man. Her face was still as pale as paper, and her tears did not stop, but her eyes seemed to have brightened a little. In that sorrow, she quietly looked at Li Ji, and then said softly, "Li darling, I remember that you should be very happy to take that money, and pave a road for yourself to ascend to heaven." Chapter 48. Li Ji clenched his fists once more. His face was ashen, but he didn't say anything for a long time. Ding Dang looked at him mournfully, her eyes gradually filled with despair. She didn't know where she got the strength from, but she slowly crawled up from the ground. The mountain breeze blew, and her clothes fluttered in the wind. Her pink dress was like a peach blossom in spring, beautiful and delicate. Her hand lightly brushed her face, wiping away her tears, but she couldn't wipe them clean. Her white fingers picked up her loose hair and placed it beside her ear, making her look more tidy and beautiful. Under the sunlight, the peach blossom-like woman trembled slightly in the wind. It was as if she was at her most beautiful and desolate before withering. She softly said, "Li, do you dislike me?" Li Ji didn't say anything. Ding Dang stared at him in a daze. After a while, she slowly lowered her head and said, "I know." Li Ji snorted and suddenly said, "Don't pretend to be so pitiful. Do you think I don't know what you're thinking when you suddenly lit a torch at the top of the mountain? Isn't there a lover at the bottom of the mountain that you're calling up? These days, you've been cuckolding me countless times." As he spoke, his face became incomparably angry as he stared fixedly at Ding Dang. Ding Dang shook her head, her face pale. "I didn't do anything wrong. But if you must think that way, there's nothing I can do. If you don't want me, I. She seemed to be in so much pain that she couldn't speak. After a while, she gritted her teeth and said, "If it wasn't for you, I would still want to cultivate. Give me back my spirit stones. At worst, we'll just become strangers." Li Ji angrily said, "Didn't I tell you just now? I don't have them now. 1,000 spirit stones is not a small amount. Wait for me for a while. At the latest, I'll return them to you in a year." Ding Dang put her hand on her chest and smiled sadly. "You also know that it's not a small amount. How can I wait for you for a year? I don't know what you'll be like by then. In short, I beg you to give me a way out. Either bring me up the mountain or give me back my spirit stones. I'll take a trip to the immortal mirror." "No." Ding Dang clenched her teeth and said, "If that's the case, then I'll risk it all and make a trip to South Pine Mountain." Li Ji was startled and his expression changed greatly. He shouted, "Slut! What do you want to do? Are you trying to make me the laughingstock of the entire clan so that I won't be able to raise my head in the future?" Ding Dang looked at Li Ji, her lips trembling a few times. In the end, she gave a perplexed smile, turned around and walked towards the mountain path. Li Ji shot forward like an arrow, grabbing Ding Dang's shoulder. He angrily said, "What are you trying to do? Are you crazy? Why must you force me like this? I didn't force you." Ding Dang pushed him away and continued to walk forward, choking with tears. I am just an ordinary girl. I don't think so much. I just want." Before she could finish her sentence, Ding Dang's body suddenly stiffened, and she stopped moving. The lakeside of the Dragon Lake suddenly quietened down. It was as if even the slightest breeze had suddenly disappeared. Slowly, Tink lowered her head and looked at her body. A bloody blade had pierced through her abdomen. Dark red drops of blood slowly dripped down from the blade, falling onto the muddy ground below, mixing with the muddy mud, forming a dark color. An intense pain surged from her abdomen like a tidal wave, as if tearing her delicate body apart, crushing her heart. She slowly turned her head, with a trace of despair and disbelief. She looked at the man behind her. You. She pointed at Li Ji, crying out in a low voice. Li Ji growled, pulling out the blade, causing blood to splatter everywhere. Ding Dang wailed, her body trembled and was about to fall, when Li Ji suddenly grabbed her arm again. His right hand was like an Azura demon, and that cold blade once again pierced into Ding Dong's chest. Ugh! Ding Dong's entire body shrunk, as if she was a child afraid of pain. Her pale face was devoid of blood, and she looked at the man beside her in despair. Li Ji once again pulled out the blade, and took a step back. Fresh blood gushed out, and instantly dyed half of Ding Dong's body red. Ding Dang slowly fell down. Her face still had a look of disbelief, but in the end, her face slowly calmed down. She only quietly looked at Li Ji not far away, her eyes filled with sorrow and pity. Suddenly there was the sound of the wind, suddenly there was an angry roar, and suddenly a figure rushed out from the mountains, in a moment rushing in front of Li Ji, knocking him away from Ding Dong's side. Li Jiren was startled in mid-air, but he immediately turned his hand and stabbed the blood-stained blade towards the figure that was rushing towards him. The person who rushed out was Lu Chen. Facing the blade, he dodged to the side, and punched towards Li Ji's face. Li Ji had already been a disciple of the Thousand Autumns sect for a period of time, and even though it could not be said to be a small success, it could be said that he had made some progress in the lowest realm of cultivation, the Qi refining realm. No matter what, he was still stronger than the average person. So when he saw that the person was the villager from Qingshitang village at the foot of the mountain, he immediately laughed coldly, steadied his body, and raised his arm. As long as he blocked this sneak attack, then he would be able to kill this mortal without any cultivation. It would be a piece of cake. However, at this moment, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right thigh. In an instant, he felt as if his body was being torn apart. Li Ji screamed and retreated in terror. Looking down, he saw that when Lu Chen's fist was about to hit his face, his other hand had viciously grasped a black dagger. Moreover, it had mysteriously and silently avoided all of his senses, directly stabbing into his thigh. Immediately after, it viciously pulled to the side, fiercely cutting out a ghastly wound. This kind of method, this kind of evil, it was really something he had never heard of before. He obviously did not have any cultivation, and was just a normal person, but in reality, in an instant, he was almost defeated. Li Ji could not stand steadily, and directly fell to the ground. For a moment his eyes looked at the black short sword in Lu Chen's hand that was like a devil, and actually had some traces of fear. Lu Chen still wanted to go forward, but suddenly from behind, he heard Ding Dang's voice. Lu Chen. Lu Chen's footsteps paused for a moment. Looking at the frightened Li Ji, he immediately put away the short sword, walked to Ding Dang's side, and hugged her body. In the blink of an eye, blood gushed out, staining the clothes on his chest. Lu Chen did not say anything, only lowering his head to look at Ding Dang's body. His gaze swept across the girl's bloody stomach, and then looked at the wound on her chest. Ding Dang trembled. Lu Chen silently hugged her tighter. Ding Dang looked at him with some difficulty, and said in a low voice, "My injury. Can you still save me?" Lu Chen hugged her, and after a moment of silence, he slowly shook his head. Ding Dang began to cry. She cried in grief, her tears like pearls falling down, landing on her bloody body. After a moment, she looked at Lu Chen with hazy teary eyes, like an innocent child carrying her last hope, stretching out her bloody hands, and lightly and weakly grabbed onto Lu Chen's clothes, leaning her head on his chest, choking with sobs. Even her voice was trembling as she said, Am I going to die?" Lu Chen hugged her tightly, meeting her gaze. After another moment of silence, he said in a low voice, "Yes." Chapter 49. After the peach blossoms bloom in spring, they will eventually wither, falling from the branches into the wind and dust, turning into mud and dust, thus never to be seen again. Just like life, cannot keep your youthful smile, beauty, and charm. We must part in the end. When the mountain breeze blew, the lake rippled, the beautiful but haggard girl leaned on his chest, waiting for the final farewell. Just like the spring wind was gone, the peach blossoms were about to fade, just like that, they quietly withered. She slightly turned her head, looking at the faraway Li Ji who had fallen to the ground. Her eyes seemed to have some complicated emotions, then she retracted her gaze, landing on Lu Chen. Her face became more and more pale, but her expression gradually calmed down, as if she had finally accepted the final outcome. She even forced a laugh in a low voice. No one knew what she was laughing at. Was it Lu Chen, Li Ji, or herself? Hey! Ding Dong's voice was so soft that it was almost indistinct. She said to Lu Chen, have you ever liked me? Lu Chen looked at Ding Dong, thought for a moment, and said, I should have. Ding Dong laughed, although in the middle she violently coughed twice, and said in a low voice, lying again. Why would the person who likes me say that I should or shouldn't? Lu Chen did not say anything, only quietly listening. Ding Dong sighed, weakly leaning on his chest, and then said, I like that person, but it's a pity that I misjudged him. Lu Chen said, don't talk anymore, rest for a while. Ding Dong ignored him, lightly panting for a while, then said, Lu Chen, I'm about to die, can you promise me one thing? Lu Chen looked at her, and said, speak. Ding Dong laughed somewhat miserably, then turned her head to look at Li Ji, looking at the man with a face filled with fear. At this moment he was no longer as confident as before, but a trace of gentleness surfaced in her eyes, and then she said in a low voice, I beg you to let him go. Lu Chen stared at Ding Dong. After a moment, he said, he caused you to become like this, he looked down on you, he also. Ding Dong shook her head and did not refute anything, only saying one sentence, I still like him. Lu Chen's voice came to an abrupt halt. He didn't say anything else and only silently looked at the woman in his arms. In the end, he softly said, is it worth it? Ding Dong's hand that was grabbing onto his clothes slowly loosened, as if the last of her strength was gradually disappearing. However, she seemed to be much more relaxed, with a gentle smile on her face. It was as if she was at her most beautiful age, and her most gentle dream had finally come true, to have a person she loved to spend the rest of her life with, to be a celestial family, to be free and unfettered. She said to Lu Chen with a smile. With the dazzling blood and soul-stirring beauty of despair between life and death, she said, who cares? Her head slowly drooped, but her gaze was still fixed on Lu Chen, and there was a hint of pleading in her gentleness. Lu Chen took a deep breath and said, I know, I promise you. Ding Dong smiled, as if the last bit of her burden had been lifted. She no longer looked at the two men beside her, and her gaze turned towards the Dragon Lake, looking at the green mountains and clear waters, the lake and the mountains. A breeze blew, and her beautiful hair gently fluttered in the wind, giving off a strange sense of gentleness. What a beautiful lake! Ding Dong said in a low voice, and then closed her eyes. On Tea Mountain, by the Dragon Lake. Silence reigned. After an unknown period of time, Lu Chen gently put down Ding Dong's gradually turning cold body, and then stood up, walking towards Li Ji. Li Ji pressed on the wound on his thigh, and somewhat fearfully retreated. He was originally a young master of a rich family, and had never suffered since he was young. Even when his family fell, he still lived a much better life than most mortals. As for entering the Thousand Autumns sect to cultivate, because the time was too short, he did not truly experience the fighting and killing of cultivators. He would kill in a frenzy, but he would also feel pain and fear under the blood. Don't come over, don't forget, you promised Ding Dong that you wouldn't kill me. Li Ji shouted loudly. As he shouted, Lu Chen walked in front of him, looked at him, and then without saying a word, suddenly struck the back of his neck. Li Ji's shout came to an abrupt stop, and his eyes rolled back, his body fell forward, and in an instant, he fainted. When Li Ji woke up again, he discovered that the surrounding light had dimmed, and looking at the sky, it was already dusk. There was still a burning pain coming from the back of his head, causing Li Ji to grit his teeth and groan in pain. When he sat up, he immediately discovered that the person he was most afraid of had not left. Lu Chen was still standing by the Dragon Lake, but at this moment, his clothes, other than the blood that was originally stained with Ding Dong's blood, there was also a lot of dirt and dust. In front of Lu Chen, on the land beside the Dragon Lake, there was already a newly built lone grave. There was no tombstone, no pine, only a new layer of soil, quietly covering the woman who had already been eternally asleep. The grave faced the lake, facing the mountains and the water, like a woman placing her love in this picturesque landscape, smiling but not saying a word. Lu Chen turned around, and walked in front of Li Ji with large steps. Li Ji immediately dodged, and for some reason, fear took control of his body. He clearly looked down on this person as a mere mortal, but at this moment, he did not have the heart to resist at all, and only shouted, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." Lu Chen grabbed the front of his clothes, and directly dragged him in front of the new grave, throwing him to the ground, and coldly said, "Kowtow 3 times. I'll kowtow. I'll kowtow." Li Ji hurriedly replied, and at the same time secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Since he was allowed to kowtow, then for Ding Dong's sake, he was spared his life. He heavily kowtowed, dong dong dong, 3 times, kowtowing deeply, and no one could say anything wrong. Then he straightened his body and said, "Is this enough? Let me go." Halfway through his sentence, a black light suddenly flashed past his eyes, and his voice was abruptly blocked in his throat. At that moment, Li Ji's heart suddenly contracted. He stared at Lu Chen in disbelief, and his entire body trembled. It was as if the black sword that came from the deepest part of the darkness was held in Lu Chen's hands, mercilessly and fiercely stabbing into his body. Flesh and blood were cut, and blood splattered everywhere. Li Ji loudly cried out, and rolled his body, wanting to escape to the side, but behind him, Lu Chen expressionlessly looked at him. A strange light flashed in his eyes. It was a black flame, like the flames of the 9 nether yellow springs, eating souls as food, maliciously looking down on the world. One hand grabbed his neck, and the other hand grabbed the black short sword, as if he was holding a pig. His face was filled with killing intent, and the sword fell, fiercely stabbing down again and again. One sword. One sword. One sword. One sword. One sword. One sword. He was like an evil spirit reborn from hell, cruelly and mercilessly appearing in this world, with a trace of madness and terrifying darkness. In the midst of the black flames, he used the black short sword to continuously stab into Li Ji's body, until all of his blood and life was squeezed out and crushed. Blood splattered in the air, dyeing Lu Chen's clothes red. The black flames burned wildly in the blood, like a crazy feast. "You promised to let me go," Li Ji, who had already become a bloody man, in the last moments of his life, desperately said these trembling words to Lu Chen. At this moment, Lu Chen, who was covered in blood like a demon, tightly gripped the short sword and took a step back, looking straight into the eyes of this person who was about to die, his face as cold as ice, coldly watching as he painfully breathed his last. Then, he slowly walked to the side of the new grave by the lake. He sat down, looking at the lake and the mountain, as if speaking to himself, but also to the person in the grave. He said in a low voice, "Who cares?" Chapter 50. The setting sun was like blood, illuminating the sunset on the horizon. Under the setting sun, the Tea Mountain stood silently in the crisscrossing light and shadow. Even the tranquil Dragon Lake was illuminated by the twilight. There were still bloodstains on the ground, and a lone grave had been added to the lakeside. Everything seemed to have been cleaned up. What was left was to endure the wind, frost, rain, and snow of the years to come. When the darkness silently fell, there was no longer a trace of anyone on the Tea Mountain. Only a figure in the distance was walking further and further away, slowly walking into the darkness. When he saw the village at the foot of the mountain again, it was already after nightfall. The strange and mournful wind blew on the Tea Mountain again, echoing like the wails of ghosts and the howls of wolves at the foot of the mountain. The night was like water, and the darkness was like the tide. Hidden at the foot of the Tea Mountain, it made the grass hut seem especially lonely. Lu Chen walked down the mountain path. Apart from the bloodstains on his body, his expression had completely returned to normal. Those strange black flames had disappeared at some point, and it looked as if they had never appeared on his body in the first place. Not a single trace of them remained. He walked out of the hut and glanced at the village at the foot of the mountain before he entered. In the darkness of the night, the village was quiet. There was no light at all. It was as if the village had fallen into a deep sleep in this deep night. Lu Chen stood at the door of the grass hut, and reached out to push the door. The wooden door creaked open, and the cold wind seemed to swirl behind him, whistling as it blew past. He took half a step into the hut, and his body paused at the threshold. In the darkness, the familiar grass hut was as usual. Everything was in its original place, and everything had the familiar smell. Even the bed in the shadows of the hut looked the same as when he had left it in the morning. Lu Chen stood quietly for a moment, and then he raised his gaze to glance above his head. Silence reigned. Not even a speck of dust floated down, much less withered grass. In the darkness, Lu Chen's pupils suddenly contracted. Woo! A mournful gust of cold wind blew past, like the wail of a ghost, with a bone-chilling chill, even though it was a summer night. Standing at the door, Lu Chen seemed to suddenly think of something. He stretched sleepily, shook his neck, and then looked back at the village at the foot of the mountain. He calmly retracted his foot that had just crossed the threshold. Then, he rubbed his stomach as if he was in a hurry to use the toilet. He looked around and then walked into the dark forest at the side. The darkness of the night rose and fell like the tide, filling the surroundings of the grass hut at the foot of the mountain. The forest was gloomy, as if it was coldly watching Lu Chen's lonely figure. The hazy atmosphere spread with the darkness, drifting around the grass hut like a ripple. It was like a ripple of ripples. It flowed silently from all around, gathering towards the grass hut. Lu Chen walked to the edge of the forest and even opened his mouth to yawn. He was completely unaware that the darkness behind him, as thick as ink, was gradually approaching. In the wind, there seemed to be a slight whistling sound, mixed in the night. Suddenly, the darkness suddenly flourished, like a calm river suddenly setting off a huge wave. The waves were turbulent, and the imposing manner was ferocious, with a hint of wildness and madness. And almost at the same time, even the moment before the darkness suddenly rose, Lu Chen, who was originally standing calmly at the edge of the forest with a hint of laziness, suddenly turned his body and directly pounced into the forest. In an instant, a burst of angry curses suddenly rang out. In the originally quiet and empty night, more than a dozen blurry shadows suddenly appeared, pouncing over from all directions. The snow-white light pierced through the deep darkness and refracted a chilling sharpness. It pierced through the void and slashed towards Lu Chen's figure. However, in that moment of danger, Lu Chen had already rushed into the forest one step ahead of it. Immediately, there was a burst of angry shouts in the forest, and the shadows swayed again. It turned out that there were actually shadows in the forest, but obviously not as many as outside. Or perhaps it was because they did not expect someone to rush in here, and were not well prepared, so there was some chaos in the forest. The shadows of knives and swords rose one after another, and the sound of the wind was mournful. Very soon, there was a muffled groan, and in the dark corner of the shadow, blood suddenly appeared. Outside the forest, the shadowy figures didn't hesitate and all rushed into the forest, bringing with them a murderous aura that was as strong as a mountain. Even the forest seemed to be tainted with the smell of blood. The mountain wind blew, and the forest shook violently, like a small boat shivering in the raging sea, but nothing could be seen inside. At night in Enchanting village, it was mostly quiet and dark. But on this night, the village seemed to be especially quiet and dark. The only light was in the small pub in the village. There was a candle on the table, a pot of wine, and a cup. The young child was drinking by himself. He poured a cup, took a sip, and shook his head. He smiled warmly and said to the side of his feet, "This wine is not good." The small pub was very quiet. Other than this young and gentle man, only old Ma was still here. He was still dressed the same as in the day. Because it was too hot, his upper body was bare, and he only wore a pair of large underpants. But at this moment, he seemed to be in extreme pain and disheveled. His hands and feet were tightly tied by thick ropes, and he was thrown on the ground like a fat pig waiting to be slaughtered, just beside the young child. The sentence that the young child said just now was directed at Old Ma. At this moment, Old Ma did not look good. His face was bigger than usual because of the swelling. There were bruises everywhere, as if he had been beaten up badly. The corner of his mouth was cracked and bleeding. But compared to his body, these were not worth mentioning. On Old Ma's white and plump body, there were no less than 7 to 8 large wounds that were about an inch deep and a foot long. They crisscrossed on his chest and abdomen, including his back, which was badly mutilated. It was difficult to find an intact piece of skin on his body. Below him, blood had gathered into a pool, and it seemed to be slowly seeping into the ground. At this moment, Old Ma seemed to be dying. He laid on the cold ground weakly. Other than his chest that was still moving up and down, only his eyes were barely open. He looked like he could die at any time. After hearing that sentence, Old Ma's dazed eyes flickered. He lifted his head and actually smiled, although the muscles on his face were twitching when he smiled. He said, "This is the countryside, I can't help it." The young child smiled warmly and looked at Old Ma with a hint of admiration in his eyes. He said, "So, have you thought about it?" Chapter 51. Old Ma mumbled something, but no one could hear what he was saying. The young man shrugged his shoulders and said indifferently, "It's up to you. He's a dead man anyway. It doesn't matter if you don't know his identity." Speaking of this, he glanced at Old Ma again and seemed to think of something. Suddenly, he said with interest, "But I'm a little curious. What kind of person and what kind of shadow could make you clench your teeth so tightly that you'd rather die than reveal the secret?" Under the dim candlelight, Old Ma grinned, and the young man looked at him with a smile. Two completely different smiling faces stared at each other in an incomparably strange manner. The wind blew coldly outside the house, and the night grew darker. At the foot of Tea Mountain, countless shouts rose and fell amidst the shrill sound of the wind. Most of the sounds came from the dark mountain forest, and there were also all kinds of saber lights and sword shadows mixed in. The battle was extremely intense. But because it was too dark, it was impossible to see what was happening in the forest from the outside. Even the figures flashing between the trees could not be seen clearly. But suddenly, at a certain moment, the sounds in this forest suddenly quieted down. All the clamor was like a cliff, suddenly disappearing. It seemed extremely abrupt. The night was dark like ink, but also like the mouth of a ferocious monster, full of malice. Gradually, footsteps sounded in the forest, breaking the sudden silence. Strange voices echoed in a low voice, as if they were communicating with each other. Some were angry, and some were anxious. After a while, human figures flashed, and someone walked out of the forest. It was a masked man who was covered in black. Behind him, there were many other men in black who wore the same clothes as him. Many of them were holding shiny weapons in their hands, and the red of some of the blades could even be seen on them. The air was filled with tension and killing intent, and at the same time, there was a faint smell of blood. "Where is he?" "I don't know. He suddenly disappeared." "What the hell?" "Search again. This forest has been searched carefully." "Did he escape to the mountains again?" "That's impossible. The guards outside didn't see that shadow at all." It looked like the leaders of the black-robed men were standing together, talking quickly and fiercely with each other. It seemed like they had different opinions and were even arguing with each other. After arguing for a while, the black-clothed men were finally divided into two groups. Half of them continued to search here, while the other half went down the mountain to the village. There were about 10 black-clothed men left at the foot of the mountain. They quickly dispersed, some searching the forest, some guarding the path up the mountain, and some returning to the thatched hut to rummage through the chests and cabinets. An uproar broke out under the night sky. One could tell that the black-clothed men were rather flustered and exasperated. Perhaps it was because such an accident had occurred while they were heavily surrounded, causing them to appear even more tyrannical. Not long after, a cry of surprise suddenly came from the thatched hut, as if someone had discovered something important. There was a hint of surprise in the voice. There was a sudden commotion among the black-clothed men outside the thatched hut. Several of them followed, including those who were searching in the forest. At this time, someone had already lit a torch in the thatched hut. Under the light of the torch, the people inside and outside the hut could clearly see that under the bed in the thatched hut, there was a flip-up board and a secret passage. This discovery made many black-clothed men very happy. As they spoke, someone had already carefully picked up a torch and began to explore the secret passage. At the same time, in the depths of the forest that had quietened down outside the hut, a figure suddenly stood up in a dark corner. There was a strange aura in the darkness. It was cold and had a hint of killing intent. In this corner, darkness was everywhere, but the figure seemed to be particularly thick, like ice that could not be melted. This figure took a step out, and the face slowly appeared. It was Lu Chen. As his figure swayed, one could vaguely see that there seemed to be another figure lying on the ground behind him, but it was lying on the ground motionlessly. But the strangest thing was that at this moment, Lu Chen had changed into the black clothes worn by those black-clothed men. What was even more strange was that strange black flames were burning in his eyes. He gently raised his hands, and there was a black cloth in his palms. Then, like those black-clothed men, he covered his face. Instantly, all traces of his appearance were covered, as if he had been one of those black-clothed men from the beginning. For some reason, even his temperament was so similar. He glanced at the thatched hut in the distance outside the forest and frowned slightly. In the quiet forest, he stood quietly. After a moment, he thoughtfully glanced in the direction of the village at the foot of the mountain. That shadow is a person who encountered an accident. After being seriously injured, his cultivation was crippled. He is almost no different from an ordinary person. A calm voice echoed in the small tavern. A few black-clothed men stood at the door, and lowered their heads to listen to the young man's words. When he spoke, he sounded very calm, and there was no angry expression on his face. But for some reason, these black-clothed men looked a little afraid, and their bodies were trembling slightly. "You, a dozen or so people, all of you are cultivators. You surrounded a mortal with no cultivation, and you actually came back to tell me that he escaped." The young man smiled, as if amused by his own words. He said lightly, "That doesn't seem right." The man in the middle of the black-clothed men standing by the door, after hesitating for a moment, finally gathered his courage and said, "Young master, that guy is not an ordinary person. A few of our brothers fought with him. That person's attacks are fierce, and his attacks are very fierce. He should not be underestimated." The young master sitting at the table furrowed his brows. It seemed that he didn't doubt the words of the black-clothed man's subordinate. A trace of suspicion appeared in his eyes as he muttered to himself, "What's going on? Could it be that those idiots in Zhengxiameng found fake news?" The group of black-clothed men did not dare to speak. Then, a clever gaze suddenly swept over the fat old Ma, who was lying on the ground in a very miserable state. He said, "Young master, why don't we interrogate this fat man again? He must know the news of that shadow." Old Ma tilted his head, and suddenly spat a mouthful of bloody saliva toward the door. He cursed loudly, "F***CKU. You can't catch someone, so you vent your anger on me? If you have the guts, go and catch that guy." Chapter 52. An ominous glint flashed in the black-clothed man's eyes and he took a vicious step forward. The young man frowned and there was a hint of impatience in his eyes. Just as he was about to speak, there was a sudden commotion outside the tavern. The young man's expression darkened as he shouted, "What is it?" A man in black ran in from outside the tavern and said anxiously, "The mountain is on fire." Everyone in the tavern was shocked and hurried to the door to take a look. Indeed, in the darkness of the night, 6 or 7 places on the Tea Mountain were on fire at the same time. The fires did not seem to be connected yet and did not seem too big. However, the flames were bright and burning fiercely. They rose with the howling of the mountain wind. It was obvious that it would not be long before the mountain was set ablaze. There was a moment of silence among the men in black. Suddenly, someone cursed and someone was about to rush up the mountain but was immediately stopped by the young man. He looked around and his expression turned cold for the first time. His voice also carried a hint of coldness as he said, "This place is less than 30 miles from South Pine Mountain. Once the mountain fire gets bigger, the Thousand Autumns Gate will definitely send people over to investigate. When that happens, there will be no time for you to mess around." The men in black were all silent. After a while, the young man laughed coldly and suddenly slapped the folding fan in his hand. He said in a low voice, "Set the house on fire. Kill the fatty in the tavern. Let's go." Very quickly, in the silent night, the light of the fire quickly lit up the surrounding area, surrounding the tavern in the middle. From the effect of the fire, it was obvious that this group of men in black were experts. Who knew how many times they had set the place on fire in the past? What was strange was that although the commotion was so big that night, other than the inside and outside of the tavern, the other places in Qingshidang village were still quiet. There seemed to be no signs of the villagers being alarmed. At the same time, in the small tavern that was gradually engulfed by the raging flames, 2 black-clothed men had already rushed in. They dragged out the dispirited and pitiful old horse and threw it on the empty ground in front of the tavern. The young man walked over with a solemn expression. It seemed that at this time, due to all kinds of accidents, he finally couldn't maintain that indifferent expression. He said solemnly, "Fatty, I respect you as a man, but you have seen the situation now. I will give you one last chance. Tell me the identity of that shadow and where he is now. Otherwise, you will." He gave a look to his side, and the 2 men in black who caught the old horse pulled out their shining blades at the same time. The man on the right moved slightly faster, and directly placed the blade on the fat man's thick neck. The man on the other side was a step slower, and after a moment of hesitation, he put away his blade and took a step back, standing among the crowd. As the cold blade was placed on Old Ma's neck, Old Ma couldn't help but shrink back. His face was pale. It was obvious that he was still nervous. He couldn't help but raise his head to look at the man in black. Perhaps it was an instinctive reaction at the moment of life and death. His body trembled violently. Then, he stared at the man in black who was about to kill him. It was as if he wanted to remember the murderer's face and turn into a ghost to take revenge. Unfortunately, this black-clothed man's entire body was wrapped tightly. Even his face was covered by a black cloth, revealing only a pair of eyes. Old Ma glared fiercely at the man in black. The man in black was unmoved. The young man on the other side seemed to have run out of patience. He said coldly, "Have you made up your mind?" He paused for a moment and snorted. He waved his hand and said, "Do it, don't." Suddenly, a scream came. It was Old Ma, the fat man, who suddenly shouted. In an instant, his original iron-blooded and unyielding temperament disappeared. He suddenly changed into a depressed and flattering look. He shouted loudly, "I'll talk. I'll talk." "Who?" There was a commotion among the men in black, including the young man, who seemed to be caught off guard. He was stunned for a moment and couldn't react for a while. The man in black standing next to the fat Old Ma seemed to be more frightened. He staggered and almost fell. Then, he seemed to be very angry. He lifted his foot and kicked the fat man. Ouch! Old Ma rolled on the ground twice. He looked like a lump of fat meat. He grimaced for a moment. The young man on the other side came to his senses. He hurriedly stopped the man in black who seemed to want to beat the fat man. He walked quickly to the side of Old Ma and said seriously, "Ma Xiaoyun." As soon as he said that, even he himself frowned. He felt that the name was too different from the fat man in front of him. However, according to the secret report from Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji, this person did have this name. But at this moment, he couldn't care so much. He took a deep breath and said, "Ma Xiaoyun, listen. My name is Shang Fei. I'm the deputy lord of the West Altar of the Three Realms Divine Sect. As long as you tell me the truth, I guarantee that you won't have to worry about Fuyunji for the rest of your life." Ma Xiaoyun, the fat Old Ma nodded and said, Thank you, thank you. You must save me. Shang Fei nodded. There was some anticipation and nervousness in his eyes. He said, Tell me quickly. Who is the shadow hiding here? There was silence, and all the men in black subconsciously held their breaths as they listened. The night breeze blew past, and only the crackling sound of the fire burning on the tavern's roof could be heard. In an even more distant place, in the depths of the thick darkness, a faint and indistinct sound could be heard, as if someone's water buffalo had finally been startled, letting out a mooing sound. Old Ma gritted his teeth. It seemed that he had gone through the last struggle in his heart. He even looked back at the man in black who was holding the knife. It seemed that he was very afraid of the knife. After a moment, he said, I don't know the original name of the shadow. But when I picked him up, his name was Lu Chen. He is 28 years old this year and has a medium build. Shang Fei raised his eyebrows and nodded slightly. Obviously, he seemed to know the basic information of the shadow. It also proved that the fat man in front of him had indeed told him everything. He said, Well said. What else? The fat man hesitated for a moment. The man in black standing next to him seemed to despise this fickle villain very much. With a low shout, he placed the knife on Old Ma's neck and shouted, Speak quickly. Chapter 53. Old Ma shrank back and looked frightened. He stammered, I'll tell you. I heard that Lu Chen came from the chopping wood pavilion. He was talented, but arrogant and conceited since he was a child. What's more, it was said that he was very lustful. He fell in love with the only daughter of the chopping wood pavilion's master during his cultivation, and then they became lovers. Later, when the matter was exposed, the chopping wood pavilion's master was furious and wanted to kill him. This scum went all the way. He even falsely accused the chopping wood pavilion to Zhengxianmeng of colluding with the devil cult. No, the divine cult, which attracted the masters of the heavenly law hall of the immortal allies to fight with him. In the intense battle, this person was heavily injured and his cultivation was crippled. But because some important people in the Celestial Alliance wanted to save face, they protected him. After that, he was transferred to the Floating Cloud Agency and became a lazy shadow that was just waiting to die. But even here, this person still doesn't do his job properly. All day long, he seduces women and harms them. He has a bad reputation in this village. As Shang Fei listened, he slowly frowned and looked a little disappointed. But then he couldn't help but snort coldly and said, Is this person so despicable? Old Ma nodded repeatedly and said, Yes, this guy is so bad. There is no good part of him. Moo. Shang Fei seemed to want to say something more, but from somewhere in the darkness, there suddenly came a cow's moo, and this time it sounded a lot clearer. Shang Fei was stunned, and there seemed to be a little surprise on his face. He suddenly turned around and looked into the darkness. It was deep in the night, and the darkness was like ink. He stared at the darkness, and the expression on his face changed. Suddenly, his face changed dramatically, as if he suddenly felt something at this moment. He shouted, Not good, run. This shout came so abruptly that none of the black-clothed men around could react for a moment. Instead, the tied-up Old Ma and the black-clothed man standing beside Old Ma with a sharp blade in his hand raised their heads and glanced at somewhere in the darkness at the same time. Suddenly, a pair of giant eyes appeared in the ink-like darkness. Each eye was as tall as a person. Although the body of the monster could not be seen due to the darkness, one could imagine just how terrifying the monster in the darkness was just by looking at the pair of eyes. This part of the world, this part of the night, also seemed to suddenly freeze. Everything was still, not even the wind could move. A moment later, in the darkness, from the direction of the terrifying giant eye, an unimaginable howl suddenly rang out. Moo. That was the third cow's moo that night, but it was far more terrifying than the previous 2 times. A violent breath instantly condensed in the darkness in front, and then rushed over like a surging river. In an instant, it covered the sky and the earth, shrouding the entire village. The darkness was like a real thing, like a violent giant rushing forward, suddenly strangling everyone in the field. All of the black-clothed men screamed in an instant and covered their ears. Those with weaker cultivation could not even stand steadily. In the crowd, in this sudden attack, only 3 people remained calm. Shang Fei was one of them, but he did not seem to be in a good state either. This violent roar seemed to be mixed with incredible power, and it directly caused a dark red line of blood to flow down from the corner of his mouth. In the blink of an eye, Shang Fei was shocked to find that not far away, the fat man on the ground and the black-clothed man holding the knife standing beside the fat man did not seem to feel anything, as if they were injured or had any reaction. At this moment, an extremely absurd feeling welled up in his heart, but with life and death in front of him, how could he care so much? He felt that the roar did not seem to be affected at all, and it was even getting fiercer. The darkness in front of him seemed to be boiling, and it was about to press down, as if the sky was about to collapse. Shang Fei screamed, his voice was sharp, and he leaped up. Then, a yellow light suddenly flashed on his body, and a palm-sized wooden figure that was very similar to him suddenly flew up and blocked in front of him. At the same time, there was a loud roar in the darkness, like a surging tide. Those black-clothed men on the ground who were holding their heads and screaming with all their might, except for the one standing beside Old Ma, suddenly froze, and then a terrifying scene appeared. All the black-clothed men's bodies suddenly exploded in an instant, and countless blood turned into a blood mist that sprayed into the night sky, forming an incomparably mournful scene from hell. Almost at the same time, the wooden figure that Shang Fei released seemed to be hit by a huge force, and with a bang, the figure instantly exploded and turned into smoke, turning into countless pieces that scattered in all directions. In mid-air, Shang Fei screamed, but it stopped abruptly, as if he had suffered a heavy blow. At that moment, he did not dare to stay any longer, and directly turned into a white shadow, desperately flew away, and disappeared into the depths of the distant darkness in the blink of an eye. The terrifying and strange roar gradually subsided, and the strange scene in the night sky also disappeared. The remains of those black-clothed men fell to the ground, and the dark red blood mist rushed into mid-air, and then gradually turned into a mournful blood rain, slowly falling down. Unknowingly, there were only 2 people left in this scene. Old Ma looked up at the black-clothed man standing beside him, and the black-clothed man lowered his head to look at Old Ma. For a long time, the 2 actually did not speak. It was not known whether it was because they were too shocked, or because of other reasons. After another moment, Old Ma's body suddenly tilted, and he suddenly gasped, as if he had touched a certain injury. For a moment, he was annoyed, and angrily scolded, "Fuck you, come over and untie me." The black-clothed man snorted, raised his hand, and chopped down at Old Ma. Old Ma shrank his head, and felt a chill on his body. The blade cut dangerously in front of him, and then he felt his hands and feet loosened, and the rope was cut. Then, the black-clothed man threw away the blade in his hand, and took off the black mask on his face, revealing his face. Impressively, it was Lu Chen. Old Ma's injury was not light, lying on the ground for a while, and he could not stand up for a while. Then, he angrily looked at Lu Chen and spat, "They can't even kill a person with no cultivation, what a waste." Lu Chen shrugged, looked at Old Ma, and said, "After so many cuts, you are still not dead. God is really blind. Get out." Hiss. A painful hum came out of Old Ma's mouth, and he slowly sat up with the help of Lu Chen. Chapter 54. Then, Lu Chen found some medicine from God knows where and began to treat the wounds of the fat man who was covered in cuts and bruises. Be gentle, be gentle. Ugh. The fat on Old Ma's fat face twisted and cold sweat dripped from his forehead. He glared at Lu Chen and said through gritted teeth, "You bastard, can't you see that I'm seriously injured? Can't you be gentle?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then poured a strange pink powder on his wounds. Old Ma shouted and almost fainted. It took him a long time to recover, gasping for breath. It seemed that he did not even have the strength to scold Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at him and said calmly, "Black snake powder is a good thing. Although it's a little painful, it can help you recover some of your strength quickly. At least you won't die on the road." The fat man's face was pale. He panted heavily and scolded weakly, F***ck off. This taste. Why don't you pour it on yourself? When I came back 10 years ago, my body was covered in this. Lu Chen said. The fat man's whole body trembled, as if he was scared. He looked at Lu Chen in a daze and said in surprise, really? Lu Chen did not answer him, only silently bandaging his wounds. It seemed that the fat man, old Ma, was shocked by the careless and flat words. After that, the fat man, old Ma, did not say any more nonsense. When the two of them were bandaging their wounds in the fire and among the corpses around them, suddenly there was a sound of footsteps coming from the front. The two of them looked up and only saw a black shadow slowly walking out from the depths of the darkness. With the help of the fire, the two of them saw that it was actually a cow coming out. An oxen. This oxen looked a little strange. Not only was it very tall, but it also had a pair of horns on its head that were as lustrous as jade. It looked unusually warm, which was quite a rare sight. Oxen walked all the way to old Ma and Lu Chen, glanced at them, and there seemed to be some disdain in its eyes. Then it mooed. Lu Chen and old Ma looked at each other. After a while, Lu Chen snorted and said, "This cow is so ugly." Moo. The green ox turned its head around. On its huge head, its eyes that were as big as copper bells glared at Lu Chen. Its aura was extremely ferocious, and it looked a little annoyed. Lu Chen ignored it. Instead, he helped old Ma up from the ground and helped him step by step to the side of the oxen. Oxen seemed a little unhappy. Its head shook twice, but it did not avoid it. It still stood in the same place, but its eyes were looking at Lu Chen more and more unfriendly. Lu Chen supported old Ma's body, and then put the fat man on the back of the oxen like a sack. Then he found a rope on the ground and tied it around old Ma's body, firmly fixing him on the back of the cow. During the process, old Ma did not say a word. It was not until Lu Chen was done and took a step back that his fat face showed some worry. He sighed and said, "What are you going to do?" Lu Chen said lightly, "Don't be a busybody." Old Ma shook his head and said in a low voice, "Don't be like this. I'll go back and beg him for you." Lu Chen snorted and said, "He didn't come himself, and only asked this stupid cow to come out. Can't you see the meaning of this?" Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "He has his own difficulties. It's not like you don't know. Besides, even if he really comes, there are so many eyes on him. He might not save you, but harm you." Lu Chen waved his hand and said indifferently, "Don't talk nonsense. Anyway, I'll wander around by myself. You don't need to worry about me in the future. Otherwise, who knows when he might die in the hands of his own people." Old Ma was speechless. Lu Chen turned around and walked away. He had only taken a few steps when he looked at the oxen again. Oxen also stared at him. The man and the cow looked at each other. Lu Chen curled his lips and said, "No matter how big your eyes are, you're still an ugly cow." The azure ox was enraged. With a moo, it raised one of its hooves and stomped down heavily. Immediately, the surrounding land shook violently. Furthermore, even the burning houses in the distance trembled violently before collapsing with a crash, adding a bit more power to the azure ox. At this moment, the aura of this oxen was like a mountain, making people look up to it. However, for some reason, Lu Chen didn't show any fear. He just looked at this oxen. After a while, his eyes gradually became gentle. He then reached out his hand and touched the head of oxen. Oxen stared at him but didn't dodge. Lu Chen rubbed the green ox's head and patted it lightly. Then, he turned around and strode away. Very quickly, he walked into the darkness and disappeared. No one knew where he went in the end. After watching Lu Chen's figure disappear into the darkness, oxen moved softly in that direction. Then, it turned around and walked in another direction. It left Enchanting village, leaving behind a dark and burning house and a messy place. At this moment, in the distant night sky, there seemed to be the radiance of a sword flashing, speeding toward them from the direction of South Pine Mountain. The green ox carried the grumbling fat old horse on its back. After walking out of the village, it quickened its pace. Almost in the blink of an eye, it disappeared into the even deeper darkness. This was the era of the immortal Tao. The billions of people in the world only believed in the great Tao of immortals. They didn't know anything about the government or the imperial court. This was especially true in the vast central divine continent. 3,000 years ago, Kunlun and Tian Luo were the initiators. In the following 100 years, the three major sects, Tai Yao, Feng Yu, and Thousand Extremes, joined forces to create Zhengxianmeng. During this period, countless heroes worked hard to expand and strengthen their strength. Until today, Zhengxianmeng had become a colossus that was second to none in the cultivation world of the divine central continent. Zhengxianmeng mediated disputes among the cultivation sects in the world, guided their cultivation, regulated their finances, balanced their forces, pacified the righteous, and suppressed evil. More than 1,000 years ago, it led countless cultivators of the central continent to fight the southern barbarians in the chaotic mountains and defeated them. From then on, its reputation soared and it was revered by the world. All cultivation sects took it as a matter of course to enter Zhengxianmeng. They even took pride in being listed on the roll of 10,000 immortals issued by Zhengxianmeng. In detail, the divine central continent was indeed a land blessed by the heavens. Its vast land was filled with countless paradises and sacred mountains. As a result, countless cultivators and cultivation families were born. Compared to the barren and barren wastelands of the southern border, it was much better. Because of this, the barbarian clans that had lived in the southern border wastelands since ancient times had always coveted the fertile land of the divine central continent. They had tried many times to pass through the chaotic lands to seize the fertile lands, and because of this, they had committed countless killings. Even so, the human clan that had lived in the divine central continent for generations had finally defeated the barbarians. In particular, in the bloody battle 1,000 years ago, the barbarian army was almost completely annihilated, and the barbarians were unable to recover from that setback. Finally, the greatest threat to the human clan was completely eliminated. After 1,000 years, there was no longer any need to worry about the southern barbarians. In fact, if it were not for the fact that the land of chaos was too dangerous and the fact that the human tribe was not familiar with the terrain, especially near the edge of the southern wilderness, there was a place called the Spirit-Breaking Sand Sea that occupied a vast area and was extremely strange. As long as the human tribe cultivators entered it, their cultivation and spiritual power would strangely dissipate, thus turning it into a dangerous land that was difficult to pass through. If that was the case, the human tribe's army might have already killed their way into the southern wilderness and completely exterminated the barbarians. In fact, the chaotic lands was a vast region that spanned millions of miles across the southern part of the divine central continent. In this mystical and strange land, the originally stable spiritual energy of the 5 elements of heaven and earth was, for some reason, abnormally chaotic. Because of this, it created a geographical terrain that was completely different from other places on the mainland. There were countless living creatures and countless treasures of heaven and earth, most of which were unique to the chaotic lands. In other words, the vast land of the chaotic lands was, in fact, the largest and most valuable treasure trove in the divine central continent's cultivation world. In the autumn of this year, a group of 3 people walked into the small city of Crescent, not far from the border of the chaotic lands. After ordering some wine and resting for a while in the busiest tavern in the city, one of the men found the owner of the tavern and requested that he find a guide who was familiar with the chaotic lands. Guides were very common in the chaotic lands. Because of the complex terrain of the chaotic lands, there were many demonic beasts, and the chaotic spiritual energy of the 5 elements, there were many unimaginable dangers and threats. For many cultivators who came to the chaotic lands for the first time, a guide who was familiar with the terrain could effectively help them avoid many unnecessary dangers. In fact, many human cultivators who had been to the chaotic lands before would often ask for a local guide when they returned to the chaotic lands, because it could indeed save them a lot of trouble. The owner of the tavern quickly agreed to this request, and in a short time, he found a few people for them to choose from. The first was a thin, dark old man with a wrinkled face. He had a pipe in his mouth, and he stood there silently as he smoked. The second was a burly middle-aged man with a stocky build. Even his voice sounded very majestic, and he looked like a small mountain of flesh. The third person seemed to be a young man in his 20s. His appearance was ordinary, and he had a calm expression. He stood there with a faint and gentle smile on his face as he introduced himself. "My name is Lu Chen, Lu as in land, and Chen as in dust." Chapter 55. There were 3 guides, but the group of 2 men and 1 woman clearly did not need so many. Hence, they borrowed a quiet room from the owner of the tavern and chatted with the 3 guides for a while. The dark, skinny old man went in for a while and came out. He squatted by the side and smoked his pipe. He did not say that he wanted to leave, nor did he look happy. It seemed like he was waiting for some result. The burly man went in and came out after a while. He sat down casually and asked the owner of the tavern for a pot of wine. He drank and looked like he was also waiting. Finally, the young man named Lu Chen walked in. The room was not big, but it was really quiet. After closing the door, almost no sound could be heard from outside. There were 2 men and a woman in the room. The leader looked to be a middle-aged man in his 40s, and the 2 people beside him were the man who looked to be in his early 20s. He was quite handsome, and when he looked at Lu Chen, there was a hint of arrogance in the depths of his eyes. The last person was a young girl who looked to be about 16 or 17 years old. She had fair skin, black eyebrows, and a jade-like nose. She was very beautiful, and she was looking at Lu Chen curiously. She seemed a little surprised that someone so young could become a guide in such a dangerous place. Seeing Lu Chen come in, the middle-aged man smiled at him and said, "Brother Lu, please take a seat." Lu Chen smiled and nodded. He sat down on the empty stool in the room. The middle-aged man did not waste any time and asked directly, "We are going to the disorienting lands to find a spiritual material called the dusk mist flower. Has Brother Lu heard of it? Can you lead us to it?" Lu Chen lowered his eyes and seemed to ponder for a moment. He then looked at the 3 people again and finally at the middle-aged man. He smiled and said, 200 spirit stones. What? Although the middle-aged man seemed to be quite restrained, his expression changed when he heard this number, revealing a look of astonishment. The 2 young men behind him were shocked at first, then angry. The young man was so angry that he stood up, pointed at Lu Chen and said angrily, "How dare you? You bastard, do you think we are stupid and want to extort money from us? Those 2 just now only asked us for 50 spirit stones at most." Little he. The one who shouted to stop was the middle-aged man. He seemed to be able to keep his composure, but his expression was also very ugly at this moment. He looked coldly at Lu Chen and said, "What my martial nephew said just now is the truth. Brother, you opened your mouth with such a high price. Could it be that you are really here to make fun of us?" As he finished speaking, his brows furrowed, and there was a faint aura of might on his face. Lu Chen didn't show any signs of fear because of the anger of these people in front of him. His expression was still calm. At the same time, he leaned forward a little, got closer to the middle-aged man, and said softly, "Do you want a 1-stripe or a 2-stripe one?" The middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and his expression changed. He seemed to have a whole new level of respect for the young man in front of him. At the same time, his eyes lit up and he said, You actually know about this 2-striped dusk mist flower?" Lu Chen smiled and didn't say anything. He just nodded. There were countless spirit materials and treasures in the world, and they all had different effects and grades. In the cultivation world, the grade and value of a spirit material was usually determined by the number of spirit inscriptions it could condense and manifest. A spirit material with 1 spirit inscription was a 1-striped spirit material, and 2 spirit inscriptions was a 2-striped spirit material, and so on. The more spirit inscriptions a spirit material had, the higher its grade and value. In fact, a 2-striped spirit material with an extra spirit inscription was often worth dozens of times more than a 1-striped spirit material. In the vast central divine region, almost all spirit materials were strictly classified under this system. However, there was a strange and miraculous place in the world, and that was the land of confusion, where the 5 elements were inverted and chaotic. For some strange reason, among the countless spirit materials in the land of confusion, an extremely small portion of them would suddenly undergo a strange change, and the number of spirit inscriptions they contained would inexplicably increase. Of course, this kind of situation was extremely rare. Even if it wasn't seen in 100 years, it was something that ordinary people could only hope for. However, over the years, the cultivation world of the human race had discovered that these spirit materials that suddenly mutated in the land of confusion not only greatly increased their grade and spiritual power, but also contained some special effects. Not only were they greatly beneficial to the cultivation of immortality, but they could also sometimes produce unexpected surprises when refining immortal pills and spirit medicines. As a result, this kind of mutated spirit material had always been highly valued in the cultivation world, and its value had always been high. However, among the countless spirit materials in the land of confusion, only an extremely small portion of them could mutate. Due to various selfish reasons, no one had ever discovered this kind of spirit material. Famous sects and large sects would always keep it a secret, and lone cultivators would either consume it themselves or secretly sell it. Very few of them were willing to publicize their discovery. As a result, to this day, there were actually only a dozen or so spirit materials that could mutate. The other mutated spirit materials were only known by a small circle of people. The dusk mist flower was one of the latter, a spirit material that was not well known and could mutate. Yes, I know, replied Lu Chen as if he was talking about something that couldn't be more ordinary. The 3 people sitting in front of him looked at each other with different expressions. The young and beautiful girl looked excited and surprised, while the man called Xiao He frowned. When he looked at Lu Chen, there was a hint of wariness in his eyes, as if he didn't completely trust him. The middle-aged man, who was the leader, pondered for a moment, then said to Lu Chen, "Brother Lu is very knowledgeable and admirable. To tell you the truth, it would be best if the 3 of us could find a mutated 2-striped dusk mist flower. However, this kind of thing can only be found by luck. We can only ask a guide to bring us to the land of confusion to find where the dusk mist flower grows, and then we can try our luck one by one. Brother Lu, although you are very knowledgeable, if you want to pay 4 or 5 times more than the other 2 just because of this, then we really can't." "What if I promise to bring you to the 2-striped dusk mist flower?" asked Lu Chen. "What, you can really find it?" This time, it was the pretty girl who blurted out. Seeing the joy on her face, she couldn't help but stand up. Lu Chen smiled at her, then said to the middle-aged man, "In the market, a mutated spirit material is worth at least 1 grade higher than a spirit material. In other words, a 2-striped dusk mist flower is equivalent to a 3-striped dusk mist flower, and its rarity is much higher. So, 200 spirit stones isn't that high, is it?" The middle-aged man was silent, but Xiao He, who was behind him, snorted and said, "You're right, but how can you guarantee that you can find such a rare 2-striped dusk mist flower?" Lu Chen shrugged and didn't argue with Xiao He. He only raised 2 fingers to the middle-aged man and said, 200 spirit stones. "Oh, right." Then, as if remembering something, he added, "I only care about bringing you to find this thing. As for how to pick it, store it, or if we encounter demonic beasts or poisonous creatures along the way, or if other cultivators try to rob us of it, I don't care." Chapter 56. After stating his conditions, Lu Chen left the room and waited in the tavern like the 2 people in front of him. After discussing behind closed doors for a while, the 3 of them walked out of the small house. The middle-aged man in the lead walked directly in front of Lu Chen and said, "Pay half first, and then pay the other half after we find the item." Lu Chen raised his head, smiled at him, and nodded. Coming out from the south gate of the Crescent City, they walked along the road that could barely be considered flat but was overgrown with weeds. They could see many pedestrians on the road, as well as the 2 mountain peaks in front of them that looked like screens. The road extended forward, and it seemed to lead to the foot of the mountain. Lu Chen and the 3 employers that had already been introduced to each other were walking on the road. The middle-aged man in the lead was called Han Nanzu, the young man was called He Gang, and the last beautiful woman was surnamed Yi, with a single name, Xian. However, their self-introductions were limited to this. They did not mention a single word about their background, and it was hard to say whether these names were real or fake. However, Lu Chen didn't mind this at all. In a place like the disorientated land where good and bad people mixed together and danger lurked in every corner, everyone had to be cautious. Moreover, Han Nanzu and the others didn't try to get to the bottom of Lu Chen's identity and origins. Perhaps they also knew that they wouldn't be able to learn much from Lu Chen. After walking for a while, Lu Chen pointed at the two mountains in front of them and smiled at the three people beside him. The two mountains in front of us, the one on the left is called Tiger Mountain, and the one on the right is called Dragon Mountain. There is a canyon between the two mountains, commonly known as One Line of Sky, and also known as Leaping Tiger Gorge. It is said that a long time ago, someone saw a fierce tiger jumping from this mountain to that mountain, hence the name. Could it be that there are really fierce tigers on this Tiger Mountain? The one who said this was Exian with a curious expression. Lu Chen smiled without saying a word, but he gang snorted and said, "Junior sister, these are just wild rumors, how can you take them seriously?" Exian's face turned red, and she made an "oh" sound, looking a little embarrassed. Lu Chen pretended that he didn't see anything as he smiled and said, "Once we pass through the Leaping Tiger Gorge, we will be considered to have entered the land of chaos. Although there won't be much danger in the beginning, the deeper we go, the more chaotic the five elemental spiritual energy will be. The various demonic beasts will also become more ferocious and powerful, so everyone should be careful." Han Nanzu nodded slightly, but before he could speak, he gang calmly said, "It's just the outer regions of the chaotic lands. If there are any dangers, we will naturally deal with them. Since your cultivation is low, don't drag the three of us down." "Senior brother." Exian called out to He Gang, as if she felt that his words were a little unpleasant. Han Nanzu, who was walking in front, also frowned slightly. Lu Chen didn't seem to be angry, but instead smiled and said, "Brother, he is right. In terms of cultivation, I can't compare to the three of you. I barely have the ability to protect my life. If I encounter any danger in the future, I will try my best to hide and not cause trouble for the three of you. However, if we encounter any danger that is difficult to deal with, we can only ask for Brother He's help when the time comes." Hearing Lu Chen's humble words, He Gang's expression immediately eased up and he said with a slightly proud expression, "Of course, we still need to rely on you to find the two-striped dusk fog flower." Lu Chen laughed and cupped his hands, "Then I will thank Brother He in advance." He Gang smiled and didn't reply, only walking forward with his hands clasped behind his back. At the side, Han Nanzu saw this scene and frowned. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he shook his head and remained silent. The four of them walked for about half an hour and finally arrived in front of the Leaping Tiger Gorge that Lu Chen had mentioned. Standing at the foot of the Green Mountain, they suddenly felt that the surrounding trees were dense and the temperature seemed to have dropped significantly. A gorge passed through two mountains, with only one winding mountain path winding around the gorge. The widest part of the path seemed to be only 6 or 7 feet wide. At this moment, the Leaping Tiger Gorge wasn't empty. Although it wasn't as lively as the Crescent City, there were still some people coming and going. From their appearance and clothing, they seemed to be cultivators. However, apart from those who were traveling with them, when they passed by or approached someone else, those cultivators' eyes would reveal a very obvious vigilance. Needless to say, the cultivators walking in the Leaping Tiger Gorge were those who planned to explore the disorienting lands, or those who had already explored and returned. Under Lu Chen's lead, Han Nanzu and the others also entered the Leaping Tiger Gorge. Once they entered the gorge, they saw that the surrounding scenery had changed once again. On both sides of the gorge, there were towering rocks, old trees, and ancient vines everywhere. From time to time, there would be grotesquely shaped rocks jutting out of the gorge. In addition to the occasional appearance of a mountain spring, the mossy water converged to form a stream, giving the place a sense of a different scenery with each step. As for Exian, it seemed like this was the first time she had come to the disorienting lands. She looked at the scenery in front of her with admiration, occasionally exclaiming in surprise when she saw one or two unique sceneries. She seemed to still have a childlike innocence, making the journey a bit more lively. The Leaping Tiger Gorge was rugged and narrow, but the entire journey was uneventful. An hour later, they arrived at the entrance of the gorge. At the end of the path was a large stone with the word, "Disorienting Lands," engraved on it. The four of them stopped next to the large stone. Han Nanzu and the others looked at each other with solemn expressions. Once they passed through this stone, they would officially enter the Disorienting Lands. For many years, this place had always been known for its dangers. Since ancient times, it had devoured the lives of countless cultivators. It could be said to be an ominous place. In comparison, Lu Chen appeared calm and relaxed. He walked over to the stone and lightly patted it. Then he smiled at Han Nanzu and the others before walking past the stone. Han Nanzu and the others quickly followed. As soon as they walked out of the Leaping Tiger Gorge, Han Nanzu and the others suddenly felt a strange and inexplicable feeling sweep past their bodies. It was like an invisible breeze, causing the spiritual energy in their dantian's qi to tremble for no reason. But after carefully sensing it, they discovered that there wasn't much of a difference. Lu Chen said, "We have only just entered the Disorienting Lands, so the 5 elements of chaos are not obvious. At the very least, within 1,000 miles of the Disorienting Lands, there is no effect on the cultivation of human cultivators. There is no need to panic." Han Nanzu nodded with a calm expression. It seemed that he had some experience in the Disorienting Lands. He said, "Many thanks for Brother Lu's reminder. What do we plan to do next?" Lu Chen said, "The dusk mist flower that you are looking for can be found in the Black Armor Mountain about 150 miles to the southwest. However, the road is difficult to traverse and there should be some obstacles along the way. It will take about a day or two to get there." Han Nanzu nodded. "Since that is the case, then we should hurry." Lu Chen agreed with a smile and led the way forward. At the same time, he raised his head to look at the sky. In this late autumn season, the sky was clear and blue. The world was tranquil and there were even a few white clouds slowly drifting by. High up in the sky, far away from the sight of these 4 people, a layer of white clouds floated like silk. A few rays of sword light suddenly shot out from the layer of clouds, streaked across the horizon, and flew towards the depths of the land of chaos. Chapter 57. The land of chaos was extremely vast, spanning over 1,000,000 miles. It was filled with countless dangers and countless lives had been lost there since ancient times. However, the lessons learned through blood and tears were not without value. Today, the cultivation world of the divine central continent had a general understanding of this vast and mysterious and chaotic land. Roughly speaking, the land of chaos could be divided into 3 parts. From the northernmost boundary to the south, it extended for hundreds of thousands of miles to the great river, Dragon River. This was the outer boundary of the land of chaos. Beyond the Dragon River, one would continue for hundreds of thousands of miles to the south until they reached the unreachable Great Snowy Mountain. This was the central part of the land of chaos. Further south was the core of the land of chaos, but it was also the most dangerous region. Countless dangerous places and terrifying creatures resided in this place known as the Abyss of Chaos, including the spirit-shattering sand sea that human cultivators feared. Generally speaking, the deeper one ventured into the land of chaos, the more chaotic the 5 elements would be, and the more dangerous the various dangers would be. Even though there was no publicly acknowledged boundary, there was a kind of secret consensus in the cultivation world of the Central Plains. That was, most of the cultivators who came to the land of chaos were only active in the outer boundary of the land of chaos. As for the wider central region, the degree of danger there was such that only cultivators at the Jin Dan stage or above were qualified to go there. As for the core of the land of chaos, the abyss of chaos was so dangerous that it was said that even spiritual master Yuanying did not dare to set foot there. It could be said to be the most dangerous place in the world. The Black Armor Mountain that Lu Chen was leading Han Nanzu and the others to was only near the border of the land of chaos. It was only a few hundred miles deep into the land of chaos. In a place like this, the spiritual energy of the 5 elements in the land of chaos was not very chaotic. For most human cultivators who came here, they would at most feel a slight obstruction in the circulation of their spiritual energy. Apart from that, they were almost negligible. Along the way, Lu Chen and Han Nanzu were fine, but He Gang and Exin were on high alert. They kept a close eye on their surroundings, afraid that some ferocious and powerful demon beast would jump out of the bushes beside them if they were not careful. However, as the sky darkened, they had covered about half the distance. In the end, apart from a wandering lynx demon beast, they encountered no other dangers. Even that lynx, which did not seem to be a powerful demon beast, was cut in half by He Gang's sword. In the evening, Lu Chen brought them to the foot of a mountain. After turning left and right, they found a large boulder and circled around it. To their surprise, a dry cave was revealed. He turned around and smiled at Han Nanzu and the others, saying, "Let's sleep here tonight." After entering the cave to tidy up and settle down, Exin, who had been on high alert for the entire day, felt as though she had used all her strength to strike empty air. She couldn't help but ask Han Nanzu, "Senior Uncle Han, didn't they say that the disorienting lands is filled with demonic beasts, poisonous creatures, and all kinds of unimaginable dangers? Why haven't we encountered anything on our way here? I don't think it's any different from outside the disorienting lands." Han Nanzu glared at her and snappily said, "You've never seen the world, don't talk nonsense." After saying that, he turned to look at Lu Chen and said seriously, "I didn't expect Brother Lu to be so familiar with the terrain of this area. If it's still the same tomorrow, let alone finding the dusk mist flower, just the fact that you've brought us along this part of the road is worth the price." Lu Chen smiled and said, "You flatter me." At this moment, He Gang, who was sitting to the side, showed a trace of dissatisfaction on his face. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Lu Chen saw He Gang's expression from the corner of his eye, but he didn't take it to heart. He only smiled and said, "In the disorienting lands, it has always been more dangerous at night. Even this area near the edge of the disorienting lands is much more dangerous at night than during the day. However, this place is very safe and there aren't any powerful demonic beasts nearby. After resting here for the night, we'll continue our journey tomorrow." Han Nanzu nodded and said, "I'll listen to you." In the blink of an eye, it was already late at night. Darkness pervaded the outside, but this night, there was a bright moon hanging high in the sky. The cold moonlight spilled over the mountains and fields. The night wind blew gently, rustling the branches of the trees. There was also the sound of insects chirping. No one knew where it came from, but it was intermittent. In the cave, the two youths were already asleep. Lu Chen leaned against the wall, his gaze falling on Han Nanzu. He saw that Han Nanzu's eyes were closed, but both his hands were placed on the sheath of his sword. It seemed that if there was even the slightest sound, he would immediately wake up and draw his sword to meet the enemy. Lu Chen glanced at the sheathed sword and then closed his eyes as well. At this moment, the chirping of the insects outside the cave suddenly quieted down. A gust of cold night wind blew past, bringing with it a slight chill. Lu Chen slowly opened his eyes. In order to avoid attracting demonic beasts, there was no fire in the cave, so most of the place was dark. However, in the shadows, Lu Chen's eyes seemed especially bright. The wind outside the cave was faintly blowing and there seemed to be some strange noises coming from the depths of the forest in the distance. However, it could not be heard clearly, or perhaps it was just an illusion of the dead of night. However, Lu Chen quietly stood up and the shadows around him flowed like water. Almost in an instant, they blended into one with him and even his shadow disappeared, becoming a part of the darkness. He followed the shadows and walked out of the cave without a sound. In the cave, Han Nanzu was still sleeping with his eyes closed. He Gang and Exin were completely unaware. The moonlight was cold and after being blocked by the nearby trees, a beam of light fell on the side of the cave. Lu Chen stood at the entrance of the cave for a moment. His gaze was calm as he slowly looked around. Finally, his gaze fell on the southwest direction. There was a forest over there. In the darkness of the night, the trees were like tall guards and the thick shadows were like cold and gloomy ghosts, appearing somewhat gloomy and terrifying. Lu Chen did not hesitate too much and directly walked into the forest. The darkness wrapped around him, as if he had instantly blended into the gloomy forest. It was as if he was born to belong to the darkness and the shadows were innate. The forest was silent, but as he gradually went deeper, the darkness fluctuated and suddenly there was a roar. The surrounding darkness suddenly trembled violently and a huge figure instantly rushed out from the darkness, letting out an earth-shattering roar. The roar tore apart the silence of the entire forest. It was as if all the darkness had suddenly tightened in an instant and a fierce wind suddenly rushed over. In the darkness, the dense stench of fangs emitted a palpitating light. In the blink of an eye, it was already in front of him and a huge sharp claw slashed down. Roar! That was a bloodthirsty roar. In the midst of the crazy roar, Lu Chen did not dodge. Only his eyes slightly narrowed. Ding! Suddenly, a crisp sound suddenly sounded. Although soft, it was loud and clear, instantly suppressing all the roars and roars. A sword light rushed out from the depths of the darkness. In the blink of an eye, the light was dazzling, like the bright moon in the night sky had fallen into the human world, blooming with a dazzling brilliance that could not be looked at directly. The sword light was like water, its momentum like a flood, piercing the darkness and cutting open the shadows. The huge figure roared and turned back, but suddenly became silent. Then, the darkness was split into two halves by this sword light. The smell of blood instantly filled the air. In the darkness, there was a rain of blood. Everything seemed to have stopped in an instant. Only that stunning and cold sword light was still moving forward in the darkness, piercing through the shadows. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived in front of Lu Chen. It was unstoppable and did not seem to stop. Chapter 58. Lu Chen took a step back, looking as if he had been frightened. His face was tense, and he had one hand in front of his chest while the other hung by his side. Then, he quietly reached behind him in the shadows, as if he had grabbed something in the dark. At that moment, the sword light was like a bright moon, its splendor illuminating the entire forest. The wind howled like a surging torrent, but in the next moment, the sword blade in the light suddenly stopped inches in front of Lu Chen. The sword light that filled the sky sprinkled down like a shower of stars, gradually converging, and finally quietly converging into the long sword that was as bright as autumn water. Darkness swarmed over, drowning the figure opposite him in the same shadow. It was vaguely a woman. Her face could not be seen clearly, the only light in the dark forest was the sword in her hand. The wind rose again in the forest, faintly blowing past. The pattering from the sky was dark red blood. A drop of blood landed on the tip of the sword, gently trembling, with a soul-stirring and strange beauty. Lu Chen felt a chill between his brows, as if an invisible sword had already stabbed down in that instant. That sword stopped in front of him, silently in the darkness. "Why didn't you dodge?" A calm but pleasant female voice came from the shadows in front of them. Lu Chen took a deep breath, said, "Your skills are too high, the sword force is too fast, I can't dodge." The woman in the darkness snorted, said, "Since it is so, why are you secretly holding a weapon behind your back? What is your intention?" Lu Chen immediately raised his right hand that was hanging by his side. Without any hesitation, he threw out the black short sword that he was holding in his hand. After a while, there was a muffled "pu" sound. The black sword was stabbed into a nearby tree trunk. Lu Chen spread out his hands, indicating that he was unarmed, and then slowly put them down. That bright long sword still stopped in front of him, did not waver in the slightest, and also did not have any intention of withdrawing. The night wind blew, that drop of blood on the sword tip trembled and twisted a few times, suddenly split into two, quietly drifting from the two sides of the blade to the dark ground. In that instant, the long sword's light seemed to brighten a little, the sharp sword tip also seemed to slightly raise its head. The surroundings were silent. In the depths of Lu Chen's eyes, his pupils also slightly contracted. But that instant passed in the blink of an eye. The long sword suddenly retreated, silently submerged into the darkness, returned to the woman's side, and then disappeared. There was a bit of light in the shadows, as if it was her bright and clear eyes. She glanced at Lu Qin, without saying anything, turned and left, disappearing into the darkness in the blink of an eye. And at the moment when she turned, the darkness surged. Suddenly there seemed to be a faint red light flickering in the shadows. Lu Qin saw that moment of light, although it was a bit blurry, but he still saw that the woman's shoulder was draped with a scarlet feather shawl. Like the wings of a bird, it spread out behind her in the night, soaring in the night, floating into the distance. Lu Qin stood in place for a while, his eyebrows gradually wrinkled, as if thinking about something. After a while, he walked to the side of the tree trunk and took back the black short sword. It was unknown what movement his hand made, but after a slight tremble in the darkness, the black sword disappeared. Then, Lu Qin took a few steps forward, and then half squatted down. The surrounding smell of blood began to diffuse, and blood dyed the ground in the forest red. Not far away, a terrible demon beast's body was split into two and fell to the ground. Black Demon Bear. Lu Qin said in a low voice, then walked over and fiddled with the remains of the demon beast with his feet. The demon core is gone, it should have been taken away by her. That sword was so powerful, it should be Moonlight Chop. He was silent for a moment, then stood up, looked into the depths of the darkness in the distance, and said to himself in a low voice, when did the Kunlun party have such a powerful young genius? But, about that shawl. Lu Qin paused, shook his head, and said nothing, then turned around and walked back the way he came. Just for a moment, the darkness followed him like a shadow, and in the blink of an eye, he also disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, after Han Nanzu and the others woke up, the group of 4 continued on their journey to the Black Armor Mountain. Perhaps it was because they were gradually entering the depths of the disorienting lands, they encountered more demon beasts today than yesterday. But under Lu Chen's lead, they still avoided most of the dangers along the way, and after half a day, they finally saw the peak of the Black Armor Mountain. Because it was almost impossible for ordinary people to enter the disorienting lands, most of the people who came here were human cultivators. Therefore, there were many places in the wilderness where there were no people, and of course, there were no roads. But there were exceptions to everything. For example, some popular places, human cultivators would come here many times, and some roads would appear after they stepped on it. For example, Lu Chen's group of 4 was currently standing on a small hill, and there was a 3-way fork in the road. Lu Chen pointed in the southwest direction, and said to Han Nanzu and the others, if we go in this direction, we will reach the Black Armor Mountain in an hour at most. Han Nanzu nodded, and looked at the seemingly inconspicuous mountain in the distance. A trace of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Standing to the side, Exian looked around curiously, and finally her gaze fell on the road under her feet, and she asked Lu Chen, Brother Lu, did you say that this road was formed by many people? Lu Chen said, yes. Exian said, could it be that everyone is going to the Black Armor Mountain? Doesn't that mean that all the spiritual materials on the mountain have been collected by people? Lu Chen said with a smile, that's not it. Although there are evening fog flowers and some other spiritual materials on the Black Armor Mountain, they are almost the lowest grade of 1-mark spiritual materials, so they can't attract too many people. The cultivators who often walk here go to another place. Another place? Exian's gaze drifted to another intersection, where the road meandered forward, leading to the southeast. What is that over there? Is there any good place to go? Lu Chen thought for a moment, and said, hundreds of miles south from here, there are quite a few famous spiritual material production areas, such as Green Sunflower Cave, 5 Peaks Mountain, Yellow Mud Pond. Usually, many cultivators go there. I see. Exian nodded, and said with a smile, Brother Lu, you are really knowledgeable. Lu Chen shrugged, and said with a smile, don't forget that this is what I do for a living. Exian smiled sweetly, but Gang looked a little unconvinced, and snorted, in my opinion, although there are several places here, the most famous ones are clearly not those. Exian was stunned for a moment, and said, Senior brother, what do you know? Gang said with an arrogant face, before coming here, I have done my homework. 800 miles south from here is the battlefield of the righteous and demonic path 10 years ago, which is also the location of the famous Barren Valley. That is the place that countless cultivators want to go to the most. Brother Lu, am I right? He Gang squinted at Lu Chen. Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and then said with a calm face, yes. Chapter 59. Exin's eyes lit up and her face revealed a pleasantly surprised expression. She said, so the desolate valley is over there? I heard that 10 years ago, the evil cult set up some kind of sinister formation there in an attempt to absorb the blood, flesh, and soul of thousands of living beings. As a result, our Zhengxiameng sent an army to break through the formation, causing the evil cult to suffer a great loss of vitality. Until now, they have not been able to recover. Lu Chen was startled. He looked at Exin with a trace of astonishment on his face. He said, set up a formation to absorb the blood and essence of living beings? Where did you hear this? Exin was about to answer, but He Gang sneered and said, Junior sister, don't listen to hearsay. In that battle, it was clearly the evil cult's evil people who secretly gathered in the desolate valley and set up the 18 Hell Prison formation. They intended to summon the Yellow Springs evil spirit army to harm the human world. It has nothing to do with living beings or blood. Exin frowned and showed an unconvinced expression. She said, no. I clearly heard Master talking about this. He said so. As she said this, she turned her head to look at Lu Chen and said, Brother Lu, what do you think? Have you ever heard of what the evil cult did in the desolate valley before? Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He revealed a bitter smile and shook his head. I also don't know. He Gang wanted to say something, but he saw Han Nanzu, who was walking in front, glared at the two of them and said, what are you talking about? Let's go quickly. He Gang and Exin seemed to have a lot of respect for this martial uncle. Hearing this, they did not dare to say anything more. The group of four continued to walk towards the Black Armor Mountain in the southwest. As for the fork leading to another direction, no one passed by. It was as quiet as before among the weeds. When they walked to the foot of the Black Armor Mountain and began to climb the mountain, the ease of the journey disappeared. Because on the Black Armor Mountain, there were almost demon beasts everywhere. Even with a guide like Lu Chen, it was difficult to find a shortcut. The demonic beasts in the chaotic lands were ferocious creatures. When they saw people passing by, they would often attack. Therefore, Han Nanzu and the others took out their weapons and killed the demonic beasts along the way. Fortunately, this place was not too deep into the disorienting lands. The strength of the demonic beasts on the mountain was only average. They were ferocious, but not intelligent. Han Nanzu and the others were able to deal with them. However, halfway up the mountain, He Gang, who had a few drops of blood on his face and body, could no longer endure it. He looked coldly at Lu Chen and said coldly, Lu Chen, why aren't you attacking? Along the way, Lu Chen had indeed been watching with folded arms. Strangely, most of the demonic beasts on the mountain were looking for Han Nanzu and the others. Very few of them went to cause trouble for Lu Chen. Lu Chen was also happy to be at ease. He had been watching the battle from the side and had no intention of helping at all. After hearing He Gang's words, Lu Chen grinned and said, we have an agreement. I only need to lead the way. I don't care about anything else. He Gang was furious, but he was immediately stopped by Han Nanzu. This middle-aged man looked at Lu Chen and frowned, Brother Lu, since we have promised you, we will not go back on our words. However, now that we have reached the Black Armor Mountain, where is the Dusk Fog Flower? Lu Chen smiled and took 2 steps forward. Looking at the mountain, he waved his hand and said, follow me. The group of 4 continued to move forward. Han Nanzu and the others followed behind Lu Chen. They saw that he was walking towards the east of the Black Armor Mountain. In less than an hour, they encountered several groups of demonic beasts. The others were fine, but when they walked to the side of a mountain stream, they encountered a group of black jackals, which was a bit troublesome. Black jackals were ordinary low-level demonic beasts. They looked similar to the dogs of the farmers in the mountains outside the chaotic lands, except that they were a bit bigger and more ferocious. Individually, even on the Black Armor Mountain, black jackals were a relatively weak kind of demonic beasts. However, this kind of demonic beasts were born to be in groups. Almost no black jackals appeared alone. At the same time, this kind of demonic beasts was relatively smarter than other demonic beasts. When they encountered prey, they would swarm together, which was not easy to deal with. On the mountain road beside the mountain stream, Lu Chen and the others encountered such a group of black jackals. There were about 7 or 8 of them. In fact, it was not a big group, but even so, these black jackals showed He Gang and Exin what was called cunning. The group of demonic beasts surrounded them from all sides. They even used the strategy of making a sound in the east and attacking in the west. Then they quickly judged that Exin and He Gang were the 2 weakest among them. Suddenly, they attacked together, catching the 2 young people off guard. Especially Exin, because she had not been in the Jianghu. When she saw the ferocious and abnormal demonic beasts pouncing on her, she turned pale and could only use 50% of her power. Fortunately, there was Han Nanzu, who had profound cultivation and rich experience on this side. He rushed forward with a sword, killed 3 demonic beasts and wounded 2. Only then did the rest of the demonic beasts retreat and saved Exin, who was a little embarrassed. During this process, Lu Chen still did not make a move. Exin was still in a state of shock, so it was fine, but He Gang was glaring angrily. Just as he was about to let loose a torrent of abuse, he suddenly saw Lu Chen standing on the stone cliff beside the mountain stream, looking down, then beckoning to them. "We're here, the dusk fog flower is right below." Lu Chen's words weren't wrong. When Han Nanzu and the others came over to take a look, they discovered that there was indeed a waterfall that was several meters tall at the bottom of the mountain stream. The water flowed down and converged into a pool, and there were many pink flowers growing on the wet stone walls beside it. This time, He Gang couldn't be bothered to argue with Lu Chen anymore. They hurriedly found a path to descend the mountain and walked all the way to the pool. Han Nanzu looked at the stone wall and smiled. "It really is the dusk fog flower. I didn't think there would be so many here." He Gang and Exin were also very happy. Their goal this time was actually to pick 10 dusk fog flowers and return to complete the task. But looking at the flowers on the stone wall, there were at least 20 of them. It was obviously a big harvest. Immediately, He Gang and Exin rushed to the stone wall to pick, while Han Nanzu walked to Lu Chen's side and said, "Brother Lu, this place is really good, thank you. But the 2-striped dusk fog flower you mentioned before?" Lu Chen nodded and pointed to the waterfall, saying, "If I'm not wrong, on the stone wall behind the curtain of water, there should be a 2-striped dusk fog flower. You should go and take a look." Han Nanzu was startled, and a trace of surprise appeared in his eyes. But after thinking for a moment, he still nodded and walked towards the waterfall. When he came to the side of the waterfall, he quickly climbed up the stone wall. Although many places looked slippery, it did not seem to be a problem for him. Not long after, his figure suddenly stopped, and then he looked into the water, plucked a large red flower from behind the water, and then jumped down. After landing on the ground, Han Nanzu carefully looked at the red flower in his hand, and suddenly a smile appeared on his face. He nodded and said with a smile, "It really is a 2-striped dusk fog flower." After thinking for a moment, he directly took out a small bag from his bosom and threw it to Lu Chen. "Your remaining half of the reward." Lu Chen caught it and nodded with a smile. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly frowned and looked back. The wilderness was quiet. Other than the sound of the mountain breeze blowing through the treetops, there was almost no other movement. Just that right now, there was something strange. In the wind, there seemed to be 1 or 2 light long howls and barks coming from afar. Lu Chen's face darkened, and he turned around with a frown. He said to Han Nanzu, "Stop picking, let's leave this place." Chapter 60. Why is that? Han Nanzu was startled and asked doubtfully. Lu Chen did not answer him immediately. Instead, he raised his head and called out to He Gang and Exian, who were climbing the stone wall not far away, "You two, come down first." He Gang and Exian looked back and were also a little surprised, but they quickly followed the stone wall down. Walking to Lu Chen, Exian rushed to ask, "Brother Lu, we are picking dusk fog flowers, why did you call us down?" Lu Chen said, "Don't pick them first, we'd better leave this place immediately." Ah. He Gang and Exian were both taken aback, their faces revealing a stunned expression. Han Nanzu frowned as he gazed at Lu Chen and said, "Brother Lu, what exactly has happened?" Lu Chen said, "I feel that there is something wrong with the surroundings, there may be more black jackals coming." He Gang immediately sneered and said disapprovingly, "It's just a kind of inferior demon beast, what's there to be afraid of?" Lu Chen raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at He Gang with a meaningful look. When He Gang was looked at by him, he suddenly recalled that when he encountered the group of black jackals earlier, his performance was a little embarrassing. For a moment, he felt a little embarrassed and said angrily, "What are you looking at?" When we encountered the group of black jackals earlier, we were only unprepared. Once we faced them head-on, who would be afraid of those beasts? I can easily defeat them. Enough. A light shout rang out. It was Han Nanzu who stopped He Gang in time. However, at the same time, there was a trace of displeasure on his face as he said, "Brother Lu, these dusk mist flowers are very important to us. Moreover, we've also fought against those black jackals earlier. I believe you've seen for yourself that there's no problem." Lu Chen sighed and said, "In this mountain forest, black jackals are in groups, and the number of dogs varies. There are only a few dogs in a small group, and there may be hundreds of dogs in a large group. If a large group of wild dogs were to come and gang up on you, it would be quite dangerous." Han Nanzu was silent, and there was some hesitation between his eyebrows. But Exian looked back at the stone wall beside the waterfall and said, "Martial uncle, we have only picked a few dusk fog flowers, there are still many more up there." Han Nanzu looked back and found that there were indeed more than half of the dusk fog flowers on the stone wall that had not been picked. At this moment, they were slightly trembling in the moist wind, looking particularly beautiful. He hesitated for a moment, thinking in his mind about the use of the dusk fog flowers after bringing them back, and then he said decisively, "Continue picking. Quickly. Once we have picked all these dusk flowers, we will leaving immediately." "Okay." He Gang and Exian agreed at the same time. As soon as he finished speaking, Exian immediately turned around and left. He Gang glared at Lu Chen with a bit of disdain, then turned around and strode towards the stone wall. Lu Chen looked at his back and shook his head slightly, then said to Han Nanzu, "In that case, I have promised the three of you to find this dusk fog flower, including the two-striped dusk fog flower. Now that I have done it, there is no need for me to stay here any longer. I will take my leave first." After saying this, he reached out to Han Nanzu and cupped his hands, then turned around and left. Han Nanzu looked at his back and wanted to say something, but then hesitated. After taking a deep breath, he turned around and walked towards the stone wall, ready to help He Gang and Exian. Lu Chen strode away from the mountain stream, walked to the edge of the stone cliff, found a high ground to jump on, and looked around. He saw that the Black Armor Mountain was densely forested, and there was a murderous atmosphere. Further away, in the forest, there were vague black shadows leaping up and down. He didn't know how many there were in the weeds, but he could vaguely see that the black shadows were moving in his direction, and their speed was not slow. Lu Chen's face slightly changed. He looked at the mountain stream under his feet, snorted softly, then turned around and strode away. After walking swiftly for over 300 m, Lu Chen suddenly heard a wave of enraged roars and curses resounding from afar in the forest behind him. But because it was far away, those voices couldn't be heard clearly. However, there were many miserable barks of wild dogs mixed within, and it was extremely clear. At the same time, strange whooshing sounds also sounded from the forest behind him. It seemed that some of the black shadows were also chasing him. Lu Chen's face darkened, and he cursed in a low voice, "The dog's nose is so sensitive." Standing in the same place and pondering for a moment, Lu Chen looked at the surrounding forest again, and then suddenly jumped on a tall tree. His movements were as nimble as a monkey's, and he climbed up the tree in no time. Then, when he reached a tree branch that was several feet above the ground, he suddenly used all his strength and jumped from one tree to another. He repeated this action more than a dozen times in a row. In this forest, he was like a nimble monkey. Unbeknownst to anyone, he leaped from branch to branch, leaped over 100 feet in the air, and then climbed to the densest branch, at least 100 feet above the ground, and quietly hid there. Not long after, he suddenly heard a sharp bark, and a large group of black shadows suddenly appeared in the forest. It was a large pack of dozens of black jackals. These ferocious wild dogs roared, as if they wanted to tear apart all the creatures in front of them. But when they chased all the way to the place where Lu Chen had climbed the tree, all the wild dogs seemed to have lost their target. They circled around in place, at a loss for what to do. The barking of the dogs was still sharp and ear-piercing, and the anger and ferocity in it chilled one's heart. But even though all the dogs were desperately sniffing in the nearby forest, and even expanding their range to more than a dozen feet away, they still found nothing. Lu Chen, who was hiding in the tree, held his breath and looked down through the gaps in the leaves. He saw a few black jackals had even run to the tree he was hiding in and searched, but they still couldn't smell anything. They looked very irritated and annoyed. Lu Chen looked coldly at the wild dogs on the ground below and did not move. Demonic beasts like black jackals were born with a fierce temperament and were the most vengeful. If these beasts found him on this tree, even if they could not climb trees, they would surround this tree and this forest. They would not stop until their prey was killed. In his memory, a long time ago, when he was still young, he had wandered around the Black Armor Mountain for a period of time. He once saw a large group of black jackals surround a bear on a tree for 7 days and 7 nights. In the end, the bear couldn't hold on any longer and was divided up by the black jackals. Lu Chen shook his head slightly and shook off the bad memories in his mind. Then he leaned against the tree trunk and prepared to wait for the sky to turn dark. Below, for some reason, the black jackals seemed unwilling to give up. Just like that, they searched back and forth in the forest. Even further away, the shouts and shouts of shock and anger, as well as the sounds of swords clashing and killing, gradually grew louder. Lu Chen glanced in the direction of the mountain stream. After a moment, he lowered his eyes expressionlessly. After an unknown period of time, the sounds of fighting gradually quieted down. Only the screams of the black jackals became more and more mournful. A gust of wind blew gently, and the leaves on the branches of the trees began to shake. It was a little cold. Lu Chen slowly opened his eyes and felt that it was dark in front of him. At this time, it was already dark. Chapter 61. The familiar night fell on this mountain, the darkness spreading like a tide, only the moonlight on the horizon shone down a little. The black jackals below had disappeared, perhaps because they could not find any prey. They had no choice but to retreat. At this time, the forest was quiet, only 1 or 2 low cries of insects could be heard from some unknown weeds. Lu Chen glanced in the direction of the mountain stream. At this time, it had long since quieted down, and there was no longer any movement. Lu Chen was expressionless, his face hidden among the branches and leaves looked exceptionally cold, completely different from his usual gentle expression in front of others. In the dim light, his eyes looked especially bright, like a silent beast hiding in the night. The forest under the night was quiet and cold. After a while, suddenly a figure rushed out of the darkness, staggering and running desperately, not caring even if the thorns in the forest hung on her clothes. Then, in the distance behind the figure, a few barks suddenly sounded, as if the appearance of the black figure had alarmed something, and then there was a terrible noisy roar, surging over here again. The black figure heard the shrill cries behind her, her body trembled, ran faster and faster, all the way to the tree where Lu Chen was. As she got closer, Lu Chen looked down from the tree and suddenly frowned. The person was slender and pretty, but her face was full of fear. It was Enchanting. This young girl's face was full of panic and even a little despair, as if she was running forward desperately out of the desire to survive. No one knew how she survived alone in the mountain stream during the day. Lu Chen frowned, turned his head to look at the darkness in the distance, listening carefully to the distance where the barks came from. After a moment of hesitation, he stretched out his palm and pressed the tree trunk, quietly sliding down from the tree. As soon as his feet landed on the ground, the feeling was completely different from when he was on the tree. Behind him was a deep darkness, but in the deep shadows, it seemed that a large group of terrible monsters would rush out at any time and tear him to pieces. Without hesitation, Lu Chen turned and ran forward. In this forest, his figure was fast and abnormally agile, looking like a monster, far better than Exin who was running desperately in front of him. In just a few leaps and bounds, he had caught up to the fleeing woman. Lu Chen grabbed Exin's arm from behind. Exin's entire body shook violently, and she suddenly let out a shrill cry. Her voice sounded as if her heart was being torn apart, and with despair and a bit of madness on the verge of death, she turned around and slashed with her sword. The sound of the sword cutting through the air was sharp. It could be seen that Exin used all her strength. Lu Chen dodged to the side, avoiding the sword, at the same time said in a low voice, "It's me, Lu Chen." Exin's sword slashed empty air, her body was brought forward 2 steps, and just as she was about to fight again, she suddenly heard the sentence. Her body suddenly trembled, her eyes revealed a look of disbelief, looked at Lu Chen, and then her lips flattened, as if she was about to cry, said, "Brother Lu, my martial uncle and senior brother." Lu Chen directly interrupted her crying, grabbed Exin's hand, and ran forward. At the same time he hurriedly said, "Don't talk nonsense. Let's run for our lives first." Exin was pulled by him, and she couldn't help but follow him. But after running for a while, Exin suddenly realized that something was wrong. Lu Chen didn't bring her along the mountain path they came from. Instead, he rushed directly into the dense forest in another direction. There were thorns and weeds everywhere, there was no path at all, and it was extremely difficult to run. After running for a short distance, Exin felt that not only were her clothes torn a few times, but there were also 4 or 5 wounds on her body. "Are we going the wrong way?" Exin shouted in panic. Lu Chen did not look back, just pulled her forward, and said at the same time, "Yes, the wild dogs will be here in the blink of an eye. Running along the original path is courting death." Exin's mind was in a mess, but she could feel Lu Chen's hand holding her steady and strong, making her subconsciously run with Lu Chen. And in this short time, in the darkness behind them, the terrible barking of the wild dogs had become much clearer. Obviously, the black jackals were rushing over here. The 2 of them fled through the thistles and thorns that were almost impenetrable. In just a short while, Exin felt as if she was being sliced apart by 1,000 cuts. Her entire body was pierced, torn, and even bleeding by the sharp thorns. Just when she was at a loss of what to do, all of a sudden, her feet slipped. In front of the 2 of them, there was suddenly a downhill slope, and the slope was very steep. Exin let out a scream, but before she could react, Lu Chen had already grabbed her wrist and dragged her down the hill. They instantly became 2 rolling gourds, rolling down the hill. In the darkness, the roar of the wild dogs broke through the air and reached the hillside in the blink of an eye. There was a fishy smell in the air, but Exin didn't have time to think about it. She had completely lost control of her body and kept rolling around. She didn't know how many rocks and hardwood she hit in the middle, but she was covered in cuts and bruises. She only felt that the whole world was spinning, and strange stars kept flashing in front of her eyes. Her body seemed to no longer belong to her and was about to fall apart. There was only a blank space in her mind. The only remaining thought was probably, "Am I really going to die in this wilderness?" She didn't know when, but the rolling speed suddenly slowed down. After rolling for a distance, it finally stopped. Exin was in a daze for a while. She stood up, but her body suddenly tilted and fell to the side. After trying several times, she barely managed to maintain her balance and stood on the same spot. She gasped for breath and looked around. She saw that she was at the bottom of the hill. The surroundings were overgrown with weeds, but there were no tall trees. Moreover, there was the sound of water coming from somewhere nearby. Woof woof. Roar, a wave of mournful barking came again. Exian's body trembled and she looked back. In the dark night, with the help of the weak moonlight, she could see black shadows jumping on the hillside. It was the ferocious black jackals chasing after them like maggots. A hand reached out from the shadows again. Lu Chen appeared beside her and grabbed Exian's arm, running forward with large strides. "Hold your breath," he shouted loudly. Exian was stunned and said, "What?" Before she finished speaking, she suddenly felt her body become light. It was Lu Chen who had jumped out with her. When they flew over the grass in front of them, the entire terrain suddenly opened up. There was no land under their feet, but a rapid river in the mountains. Pooh! There was a loud sound and water splashed everywhere. The two of them fell directly into the rapid river and disappeared in an instant. Chapter 62. The rapid river instantly drowned the two of them. A bone-piercing chill surged over, like a knife piercing into their flesh. Exian struggled with all her might, but her body was involuntarily swept forward by the current. She was like a piece of withered leaf in the water, constantly bumping into the hard rocks at the bottom of the river, and at the same time she could not breathe. She became more and more panicked, only feeling that everything in front of her was pitch black. There was only endless terrifying torrents in front of her, as if the next moment she could fall into a bottomless dark abyss. She could not help but cry out loudly, but before she could cry out, the moment she opened her mouth, the cold river water poured into her mouth, immediately suppressing all sounds. She choked on a large mouthful of water, violently coughing. At the same time her body was even more panicked, like a stiff rolling log in the water, rampaging about. But at this time, an arm stretched out from the side, hugging her body from behind. Exian was like a drowning person grabbing onto the last straw. Her entire body leaned over, at the same time as she violently coughed, her hands tightly grabbing onto that arm. "Don't move." A low voice sounded in her ear. Another body leaned over in the water, hugging her, letting her head out of the water so she could breathe, while floating down with the current. Exian greedily took in large mouthfuls of air, and then gradually became clear-headed and calmed down. She no longer moved casually and just nestled in the arms of the strange man. In this mournful and austere night, in this desolate and uninhabited wilderness, she drifted along with the flow. For a moment, she seemed to have thought of something. She turned around and looked at the direction she came from. In the depths of the darkness, at the foot of the hill, she could vaguely see a group of ferocious figures squeezing on the riverbank, letting out angry and violent roars. The current was very fast, but Lu Chen's swimming skills seemed to be quite good. Even with a burden like Exian, he was still able to swim with ease in the river. At the same time, the rapid current carried the two of them away from the hillside, all the way down, disappearing into the distance in this deep night. But looking at that direction, they were drifting further and further away from the path they came from, all the way into an even darker mountain range. After an unknown period of time, the river gradually calmed down. At the same time the surface of the water widened. The wild cries of those black jackals were long gone, only the darkness between the heavens and the earth remained the same. Exian felt Lu Chen start to paddle with his arms, bringing her upstream. At this moment, after several consecutive shocks and back and forth from the gates of hell, she felt extremely exhausted, but there was still a string in her mind that was tightly wound. As long as the night did not subside, as long as she was still in this terrifying wilderness of the land of confusion, she would feel a kind of fear from the bottom of her heart, and did not dare to sleep. After a while, Lu Chen and brought Exian to the side of the river, and they walked. Splash! There was a clear sound, that was the sound of water splashing down from their bodies. The two of them were already completely drenched. Lu Chen did not seem to feel anything, but when Exian stood on the riverbank and was blown by the night wind, she immediately felt a bone-chilling cold, and could not help but shiver a few times. Lu Chen glanced at her, walked to Exian's side, and said, "Can you still hold on?" Exian forced a smile, and said, "I'm fine." After saying this, she suddenly realized that because her clothes were completely drenched, they were tightly clinging to her body, revealing all the exquisite curves of her body, making her look especially alluring. Exin felt her face suddenly heat up, and she subconsciously let out an "ah," and reached out to cover her body. Who knew that as soon as she raised her hand, an indescribably intense pain suddenly came from her left arm. Exin only felt her vision go black, and she staggered, almost falling to the ground, and her mouth also let out a painful groan. Lu Chen supported her, a little surprised, and asked, "What's wrong?" Exin was in so much pain that even her voice sounded a little shaky, and she said with a trembling voice, "My hand, my left hand." Lu Chen looked over, and reached out to support her arm for a moment, and then immediately frowned, and said, "It's broken." Exin bit her lip, lightly gasping for breath. In her mind, the scene of her escape just now replayed in her mind, but she found that she could not remember where exactly it was that broke her arm. Perhaps it was because she was too nervous and excited, or because she had suffered too many injuries on the way, so she did not immediately notice that her arm was broken. Lu Chen looked around, and after a moment of silence, said, "Sit down first and rest for a while." Exin used her right hand to support her left arm, found a stone on the river bank, and sat down, while Lu Chen walked to a place a little further away, where there were a few trees. He fiddled there for a while, and after a moment, came back with a branch about 2 fingers wide. At the moment, he was holding a black dagger in his hand, and it looked quite sharp. Exin watched him cut off all the branches and leaves, leaving only a round wooden trunk, and then he gestured to her arm. "Do you have medicine on you?" Lu Chen asked Exin. Exin shook her head, and said in a low voice, "I only have some medicine to stop bleeding, and no medicine to set bones." Lu Chen nodded, and didn't say anything else. He tore off a few pieces of cloth from his clothes, and then straightened Exin's arm, so that the broken bones were in place, and tied her arm to the tree trunk. "Let's do this for now. When the sun rises, we'll look around to see if there are any suitable herbs for you to apply," Lu Chen said calmly. In the process of tying her arm, it was naturally unavoidable to touch the broken bones, and Exin suffered a lot. But at least she knew that Lu Chen was doing this for her own good, and so she endured the pain, but her eyes were already filled with tears, and her face was incomparably pale. When Lu Chen was finally done, Exin let out a long sigh of relief, and then timidly said, "Thank you very much, Brother Lu." Lu Chen looked at her, and said, "It's very dangerous here in the disorienting lands at night, and we can't easily light a fire. Otherwise, it'll easily attract troublesome and powerful demonic beasts. We can only wait like this until the sun rises. Can you still hold on?" Exin gritted her teeth. Although she felt a sharp pain in her arm, and waves of cold constantly invaded her skin, she still nodded and said, "I can." Lu Chen grunted, and walked to a spot a few feet away from Exin, and directly lay down on the ground, saying, "Then let's rest, and wait for the sun to rise." Exin sat there in a daze for a while. Although she was extremely tired, she didn't know why, but she didn't feel the slightest bit sleepy. Looking at the deep night sky between the mountains, and the dark river not far away, she suddenly felt like crying. It was at this moment that Lu Chen's voice suddenly sounded from beside her. "That's right, where are your 2 companions? How are they?" Chapter 63. They. In the dark of the night, although Exin was sitting not far away, her figure was somewhat blurry. At this moment, her voice sounded a little trembling and deep, as if Lu Chen's words had suddenly poked at a certain part of her heart. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. "Did you encounter a pack of black jackals at the waterfall?" Exin slowly lowered her head. After a while, she said, "Yes, after you left, not long after, a large group of black jackals suddenly rushed over. There were too many of them, and I couldn't even count them all." Her breathing suddenly became a little hurried, as if she was being stabbed by memories. She said in a low voice, "Martial uncle, senior martial brother, and I fought in a hurry. Although we had our backs against the wall of the mountain, there were too many demonic beasts. After fighting for a long time, we still couldn't hold on. Uncle Master told us to split up and run. He said that one of us could escape. At this point, her voice was choked with sobs. After a pause, she continued, Senior brother and I rushed out. In the middle, I turned around and saw Uncle Master being pounced on by a large group of black jackals. In the blink of an eye, flesh and blood flew everywhere. I was terrified. Senior brother he pulled me and ran with all his might, but there were black jackals chasing after us. In the end, Senior brother he and I had no choice but to split up and run for our lives. The last time I saw him, there were more than 10 black jackals pouncing on him. Then, they were blocked by the trees. I only heard a series of screams and wild dogs barking. In the darkness, Lu Chen was silent for a moment before saying, What about you? Why were you the only one who escaped in the end? Xin said in a daze, I ran for a while and saw that I was about to be caught again. But at this moment, I suddenly remembered that before I went down the mountain, Master had given me a blinding talisman. So I climbed up a tree and used this talisman. The black jackals chased me nearby and couldn't find me. At this point, Xin suddenly burst into tears and cried, It's all my fault, it's all my fault. If I had thought of this earlier, Martial Uncle and Senior Brother might not have died. Lu Chen was silent and didn't say anything. He let Xin cry for a while. After her sobs calmed down a little, he said indifferently, This isn't your fault. And even if you used this talisman in advance, when the black jackals were right in front of you, with the keen senses of those demon beasts, you still wouldn't be able to escape. Xin's body trembled as she whispered, Really? Yes. Lu Chen responded, then turned over and said, It's getting late, hurry up and sleep. We might have to climb mountains and wade rivers for the whole day tomorrow. If you don't sleep, your body won't be able to take it. Xin's lips moved slightly. After a moment, she still slowly lay down on the grass by the river bank. Her mind was in a mess, and her heart was filled with regret and fear. She thought that she wouldn't be able to fall asleep no matter what, but who knew that as she lay down, she would unknowingly close her eyes and fall asleep. The morning sun fell on the riverbank, shining on the sleeping woman's face. Although her face was still a little pale and the ends of her hair were messy, a strand of beautiful hair still hung down from her temples and slid down to her nose, bringing with it a bit of languid beauty. Her slender and long eyelashes trembled a few times in the golden brilliance, and then Xin slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she seemed to still be in the warm home of her memories. Her kind master and close senior and junior sisters were still by her side. Someone was smiling and saying something to her, and when she was full of joy and wanted to sit up and answer, a sudden pain came from her left arm, waking her up from the illusion. Hiss! Xin sucked in a breath of cold air and bit her lips. This time, the pain was so severe that she almost cried out. At the same time, a voice came from not far away. Be careful, don't make the injured bone crooked, otherwise you'll suffer again. Xin panted a few times and didn't dare to move her left arm. She sat up straight and looked to the side. She saw that Lu Chen had already woken up and was walking over from the other side of the forest. He was holding a lot of things in his hands. It looked like some random weeds that Xin didn't recognize, and in the middle, there were some strange dark brown things. Lu Chen walked to Xin's side and squatted down to put the things in his hands to the side. Then, he grabbed Xin's left arm and examined it. He nodded and said to her, I'll help you apply some medicine now. It should heal faster, but there will be some pain. Endure it yourself. When Xin heard the word pain, her heart skipped a beat. She was a little afraid, but looking at Lu Chen's calm face, she didn't know why she couldn't say no for a moment. Moreover, no matter how she looked at it, this man was doing it for her own good. So, after hesitating for a moment, she still slowly nodded. Lu Chen gently untied the wooden stick from her arm and then tore her sleeve. On her white wrist, the area around the broken arm was already red and swollen. Lu Chen frowned and lowered his head to gather the herbs he had picked and mashed them together, including the strange black things. Exian glanced at his hands. Suddenly, her eyes straightened and she saw that the black things were actually some strange insect eggs that she couldn't name. They were black and fat and looked very disgusting. Exian was shocked and suddenly felt nauseous. She almost vomited and cried out, What are these things? What do you want to do with them? The larvae of the golden-winged bee. Lu Chen glanced at her and said faintly, Don't talk nonsense. This is good stuff. It can at least speed up the recovery of your broken arm by several times. You're lucky to be able to find it here. Exian was stunned and speechless. She wanted to say something, but she swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. It was just that she had never seen these disgusting things before. When she saw that Lu Chen had actually mashed the insect eggs together with the herbs, she suddenly couldn't stand it. She quickly turned her face away and took a few deep breaths before she slowly recovered. Not long after, Exian suddenly felt a cool sensation on her arm. Then, Lu Chen smeared a layer of sticky stuff on the wound of her broken arm. Exian didn't dare to look at the wound. After a while, she felt that Lu Chen first wrapped it with a cloth and then tied her arm to the wooden stick again. It's done. Lu Chen stood up and said to her, As long as there are no accidents, he should be fine in about 7 or 8 days. Let's get up and continue our journey. Exian gritted her teeth and stood up. She forced herself not to look at her left arm and said, Where are we going? Lu Chen said, I don't know. Let me see the direction and terrain first. Exian was taken aback and said, Aren't you a guide? You should be very familiar with the Black Armor Mountain, right? Lu Chen looked at the woman snappily and said, Of course I'm familiar with the vicinity of the Black Armor Mountain. But even if I'm a guide, I can't jump into the torrent to explore the terrain, right? I've never been to this area. Exian was speechless. At the same time, she also felt that she had said something wrong. If it wasn't for saving her, perhaps he actually didn't need to jump into the river last night. Thinking of this, her cheeks became a little hot. She subconsciously turned her head away and looked elsewhere. Who knew that as she turned her gaze, Exian suddenly saw a pair of ferocious eyes looking at them from behind a dense thicket of grass in front of them. There was a trace of viciousness in that fierce gaze, almost no different from that of a demon beast, causing Exian to jump in fright. She suddenly took a step back and pointed in that direction, crying out involuntarily, There's someone over there. Chapter 64. What? Lu Chen was taken aback. He turned around and asked Exian. Exian hurriedly pointed at the bushes and said anxiously, I just saw something in the bushes. Before she finished speaking, Exian's voice suddenly stopped. She looked in that direction with a trace of surprise. She saw that the bushes were still the same, but she didn't see the pair of fierce eyes that she just saw. Lu Chen looked in the direction that Exian pointed. He looked at the bushes and frowned slightly. He then walked over. Exian didn't know why, but she suddenly felt nervous. She also followed behind him, and at the same time, her eyes kept looking left and right. The two walked to the edge of the bushes. They saw that the bushes were lush, about a person's knee height. But at the moment, the bushes were empty. It was obviously impossible for someone to hide inside. Lu Chen pondered for a moment. He broke a branch from the side and patted the nearby bushes for a while. He only saw a few flying insects, but he still didn't see the figure that Exian said. Lu Chen looked back at Exian. Exian's cheeks were slightly red. For a moment, she was not very confident. She thought, could it be that I was too tired yesterday, so my mind is not very clear now? What I saw just now, was it just an illusion? Lu Chen walked back to her side and didn't say much. He just calmly said, Since there is nothing, then let's hurry. Okay. Exian responded with some embarrassment. Lu Chen nodded and walked forward. Exian looked at the bushes again. She saw that the surroundings were quiet, as if there was really nothing. But she carefully thought about it. She remembered that the pair of fierce and vicious eyes in the bushes was particularly clear. She couldn't help but shiver. With such a delay, Lu Chen had already walked a distance. He then noticed something and turned around to call out to Exian. Exian quickly responded. She shook off the inexplicable thought in her mind and quickly chased after Lu Chen. As the two of them gradually walked further away, a light breeze suddenly blew from the surface of the river, passing through the silent depths of the wild grass. The verdant leaves of the grass and trees trembled slightly like waves, faintly making out a blurry shadow, flashing past the grass and leaves in the distance. Lu Chen didn't go up the river with Exian. Instead, they went downstream. After walking for a while, Exian noticed this and asked Lu Chen about it. Lu Chen's answer was also very straightforward. It was easier to go downstream. If they went upstream, they would have to enter several mountain ranges, including the Black Armor Mountain. There were all kinds of demon beasts and unknown dangers in the mountains. It was very troublesome. Even if they found the way back to the Black Armor Mountain, it was unlikely that they could go back the way they came. Because demon beasts like black jackals were very vengeful, the large group of ferocious wild dogs was probably still waiting in the mountains. As long as the direction was right, they could also get out of the chaotic land by going downstream, and there would be less danger on the way. In the current situation, Exian didn't have much of a mind of her own. Moreover, after last night's escape, she had developed a lot of trust in Lu Chen, who she had only known for a few days. After all, he saved her life and healed her injuries. Even if he wanted to harm her, he would have done what he should have done last night. Therefore, she quickly accepted this reality and obediently followed Lu Chen downstream. It was a sunny day in late autumn. The river was calm and clear, and the hills on both sides of the river were undulating. It looked like a painting, not at all like the legendary land of confusion that was known to be filled with countless dangers. After walking for about half an hour, they walked along the river into a valley. Suddenly, they saw a colorful scene in front of them. Taking a closer look, it turned out to be a piece of land with a radius of several acres, covered with all kinds of colorful strange flowers. The flowers were delicate and beautiful, and each flower was extremely large. The smallest one seemed to be the size of a wash basin. Blooming under the sun, it was like a strange land of rainbows that fell into the human world. Exian opened her eyes wide and couldn't help exclaiming, "Ah, it's so beautiful here. So many beautiful flowers." Before she could finish her words, she suddenly heard Lu Chen's faint voice beside her, "If you don't want to die, then stay further away from that side." Exian turned her head back in shock, her mouth half agape. "Why?" Lu Chen didn't even turn his head back as he walked forward. His body neared the riverside and distanced himself from the cluster of flowers. At the same time, he said, "This is a bloodthirsty demon flower. Usually, it uses its flowers to lure living creatures. As long as there's a prey that comes near, countless sharp thorns will break out from the ground and pull the prey back. At the same time, the thorns have a strange poison. It's not fatal, but it can make the prey's entire body weak and unable to move. After it's dragged back to the cluster of flowers, it will turn into a bloody pulp." His words were said calmly, but Exian was dumbstruck. Her face turned pale and revealed a look of fear. When she looked at the beautiful cluster of flowers again, she couldn't help but shiver and said in a low voice, Why are there so many monsters here?" Lu Chen glanced at her and shook his head without saying a word. He turned and continued to walk forward. Exian was a little discouraged. She sighed and followed him. The two of them walked along the river and bypassed the seemingly beautiful land of demonic flowers. After walking for a while and seeing that they were about to walk out of the valley where the bloodthirsty demonic flowers were hidden, they suddenly heard a low whine coming from the side. It sounded a little mournful, and it was somewhat similar to the cry of the black jackal yesterday. Exian's first reaction was that her hair stood on end. She almost jumped up. Yesterday, she was almost killed by those terrible black jackals, so she was almost allergic to this kind of terrible sound. However, in comparison, Lu Chen was much calmer. He first grabbed Exian, who was about to rush forward to escape, and pulled her to his side. At the same time, he frowned and looked to the side of the valley exit. Exian was still in a state of shock, but she felt at ease when she felt Lu Chen's hand beside her. She looked over and was stunned. There was no black jackal on the ground. No, there seemed to be a wild dog. It wasn't big, and it looked like half a puppy at most. The fur on its body was black, but it was lighter than the black jackal demonic beasts from yesterday. It seemed a little different. Especially on its back, from the back of its head and neck down to its back, there was a long and narrow white fur band. It was very clear, showing that this puppy was not a black jackal. After Exian looked carefully for a while, she saw even more strangeness. The puppy was lying on the ground, unable to move. It could only cry out mournfully, looking especially pitiful and helpless. One of its legs was dragging behind it. Unlike the other 3 legs, it seemed to be broken. The puppy lay there with a blank look in its eyes, as if it was about to run out of oil. Even its sorrowful cries gradually became softer. It seemed that if no one helped it, it would die here in a short while. It looked so pitiful. Exian couldn't help but say. When Lu Chen heard her words, he quickly frowned and looked at the woman indifferently. You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.